guys, I'm Sai and welcome to Ace Podcast Nation. On the channel we've got podcasts, interviews and series on all sorts of subjects including mental health, football, MMA and boxing, serial killers, films and TV, conspiracy theories, wrestling, music and more. All of our shows are available in video format at youtube.com/acepodcastnation. Please subscribe as that's the best way to support the channel. We also have audio versions of every single show that we do. You can find them at all the usual podcasting platforms and apps and radio apps, whether it's iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn Radio app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. It's far too many to go through all of them, but yeah, you'll be able to find it on your favourite podcasting app. Every Monday we do a live football show, 7:30, which is the Andy Campbell Championship show, where myself and former Cardiff City and Middlesbrough striker Andy Campbell, normally we would go through the kind of championship games as well as talking the biggest stories in the football world, but there is no football on at the moment, as we all know. So at the moment we're kind of reviewing some old games, we're talking the latest news, we're having guests, doing a quiz, just all sorts of good stuff. Always fun, and we had a good couple of thousand join us on Monday, which was good. This Monday, or this past Monday when this show goes out, we have Daily Telegraph journalist and author Harry Harris joining us. He's written books on some of the biggest names in football of all time, Glenn Hoddle, Ruud Gullit. He's also written an investigative book on the death of Cardiff City striker Emiliano Sala, which is a really, really interesting book and asks some very important questions. So it's going to be good to have him come on Monday in the live show so he can take questions. And obviously he's bringing out an extended version very soon, which has got twice the amount of information and a lot of new questions. Every Wednesday we have the Danny Batten Fight Show, where myself and former Cage Warriors champion Danny Batten, we break down the weekend's boxing and MMA usually, but again there's no current events on currently, so we just review and break down some classic events. Last week we broke down Joe Calzaghe versus Bernard Hopkins, UFC 4, and Renzo Gracie versus Sakuraba from Pride 10. This past Wednesday then we talked Eubank versus Ben, Royce Gracie versus Sakuraba, and Royce Gracie versus Sakuraba 2 and UFC 5. So if you need a combat sports fix, that's the place to be every Wednesday. And then Friday we have a live adult-only comedy show with stand-up comedian Ballistic Barry Phillips, talking about the goings-on in the world and the news. And then on the weekend, to finish off the week, we have Saturdays a weekly wrestling show with post-wrestling journalist Andrew Thompson providing the analysis. And then every Sunday we drop a new episode of either our series Unscripted and Uncensored, which is one like today, or we also have My Story, where we take athletes and former fighters or actors through their careers and go through that, or just brand new guests and interviews. We have new shows all the time, at least 4 every week. We truly have podcasts or series for everyone, no matter what your interest is, and we've usually 99.9% of the time got true experts in their field breaking down the action or the subject that we're talking about, whether it's footballers, doctors, fighters, whatever the subject we talk about. I do like to get someone who knows what they're talking about to discuss it with, because I don't know what I'm talking about. I just rattle on about nothing, and I leave the experts for the analysis. Today's show is something a little bit different. Instead of the usual format where I'll do research and I'll prepare questions for my guests, or we'll do different things, this is episode number 14 of Unscripted and Uncensored. What that means is I have no real run through. I just paste all the questions into my little document by here, and we just go through everything. It's completely unedited, no censors. You can talk about anything, say anything, you can say what you want basically. We just talk. I get some talking points, some subjects or some questions sent in by people from social media. They can email it, direct message on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. It's always a lot of fun. Usually goes off the rails and definitely goes off on random tangents, and we'll be talking about some crazy random thing before we know it. But it always is a lot of fun. So joining me to dip into that random world of Unscripted and Uncensored today is a former pro boxer in his own right. a boxing trainer and media personality, White Sugar, Ben Doughty. Welcome, Ben. How are you, my friend?
I'm good, Simon. I hate to correct you at the start, but in actual
You
fact,
okay?
I was never actually a professional boxer. A lot of people think
Ah,
I
okay.
was, and some people try to expose me on that basis, saying I've checked BoxRec and he's not on there. Because when you rise to any kind of level of, I don't know, little bit of social media prominence, you get enemies, and some people try to say he's a fraud. But the thing is, I had 38 amateur fights, Simon, of which I'm proud of. I was supposed to turn pro in 1991. Insofar as I signed the forms, I went off the rails a bit, which we can talk about or not talk about. But just so I'm not, you don't get avalanches of people saying he's a fraud, he's a liar. I'm going to clarify that right at the start. I was a veteran of 38 amateur fights and never punched for pay. But I'm good, mate. Thank you for having me.
Okay. No, do you know what? I appreciate that honesty straight away because, at the end of the day, you could have just kind of left it and not said anything. I can appreciate that. I like that. That's a good start. But yeah, how you finding the current situation in the world? It's a bit strange as we're going about our business.
I have to say I haven't found it too bad so far because first of all I've not had any personal tragedies, although I do know people people I know quite well who've had close family members die, and I also know I don't know what it is, Simon, but I notice people are dying of other things right now as well. There's been a few tragedies which are unrelated, and some of them are related to COVID-19, and so I feel for a lot of people. But I must be honest, I'm having a feel a bit guilty, but I'm having a good run of it. I mean, I'm getting on with creative projects like yourself, no doubt, and I'm feeling quite inspired at the minute. There is a positive flip side to it. Obviously, we wish it wasn't happening, but I think there is a bit of a reset about life. The rat race has ground to a halt, hasn't it? There is a quite a good community spirit amongst people, which there always is in adversity. I've gotten a few things finished which I wouldn't do when I'm running around in my day-to-day life, jumping on and off London transport, doing training sessions and classes and whatnot. So I'm using the time quite well, and I'm not having too bad of a time of it. But obviously, we don't know when it's going to end, and it is a little bit rough, certain aspects of it, because I think you can get cabin fever.
Yeah, I think from a positive outlook of it, for me personally, there's kind of three things which I I wouldn't say enjoying about it, but like you say, three things which I'm taking as a positive slant on it. And I think one is my garden is full of nature. It's full of birds. It's full of
Yeah,
bees and things, which I got to say that I've noticed over the last couple of years is I get less and less at this time of year and in the summer than what I would normally have, and I would assume that's a lot to do with things like pollution and traffic and
yeah,
all these different things. And where everything is ground to a halt, all these birds are coming back, and I really enjoying that. I'm to sit
yeah.
outside and have my coffee in the morning, and there's birds everywhere. Um, like I'm an early riser, so it doesn't bother me. I know my teenage son is not so enthusiastic about the birds chirping at 5 a.m. in the mornings, but the other two
Yeah.
things is one, I am recording so many podcasts. It's unreal, and shows and videos because one, I'm not having to, take my sons to football or to the school or my wife's to work and all the, the day-to-day stuff which you have to do and this, that, and the other. So like, as soon as I've done everything which I need to do with my kids in the day, like schoolwork and that, I'm kind of spending a bit of time with them and then going to do,
Yeah.
podcasts or contacting guests. And I'm also then the other side of it, I get people who perhaps wouldn't be necessarily available, obviously at home and looking to
Yeah.
pass an hour here and there. So they're a bit easier to get hold of or a bit easier to get on the show, which is, it's great for me personally. Um,
Yeah.
and, like you say, the third is um, I, particularly when my children were young, I used to bemoan having to go to the office to work, and I felt like I was always missing out on like
Yeah. Their
things like
development.
first step, first words, all these things which you miss out because you're in work. Um, so I'm trying to look at it this positive thing that I've got this time with my kids day in day out. Now that's not to say that there's some days they haven't driven me insane, and I
Yeah.
feel like I'm really struggling, but I'm trying to look at it with a positive outlook. Obviously, with the COVID-19, it's difficult, isn't it? Like up until probably the last couple of weeks, I kind of knew like a friend of a friend of a friend people who had been affected by it. But in the
Yeah.
last month, there's been people who I know personally who've become infected, or members of their
Yeah.
family have been infected, which is, it really hits home then, because that's like just very close to home. Obviously, there's someone who I used to work with, someone who's good friends with one of my best friends who sponsors the shows, and he was in an induced coma and things like this, and it's difficult to get away from it then, isn't it? Because it's on the news constantly, but when it affects people who you know personally, it becomes very real very quickly, I think.
Yeah.
Right. So, like I say, I appreciate you coming on, mate. I even though we're in lockdown, I appreciate that you're still busy. You've got things to be doing yourself and getting on with in your own projects. So what I like to do at the start of these shows, before we put you in the hands of the people and we see where they get our conversations to go, what I like to do is first I'd like to have you basically tell us a bit about yourself. Kind of your upbringing, how you got to where you are today. And then after that, I'll ask you kind of 10 quickfire questions where you just say the first thing which comes into your mind. And what that does is it just gives people who are maybe not familiar with you, just a little feel for you and your interests and things.
Sure. Okay, Simon. Well, any kind of social media prominence I've got is based on boxing. So, I mean, the relevance of that, I grew up in the Cotswolds in Stroud in Gloucestershire. I started boxing at the age of 10. And I got really into it. I know one of the questions suggested to me from a friend of mine was, at what point did it become an obsession? And to be honest, I started boxing at 10 and got obsessed with it immediately, in terms of reading all the books and becoming a know-it-all historian at the age of like 11 and all the rest of it. But as far as I was concerned, that was a life I wanted to live. And I put a lot of pressure on myself, telling everybody I was going to go to the Olympics in 1988 and stuff like that. But to cut a long story short, when I was about... something happened that took me off the righteous path of a kind of athletic, healthy life to an extent. I left home when I was 18 after the way that teenagers row with their parents and sometimes leave acrimoniously. I left shortly after the A levels at the family home, and while I was sleeping on friends' floors for a bit and looking to get myself a place and a job, having left school after the sixth form, I went to see Guns N' Roses at Donington Rock Festival in 1988, and for some reason I got kind of, arrested by the charisma of Axl Rose and Slash on stage, and this idea of being in a rock and roll band, all the rest of it, and I kind of went off the rails in a sense. I mean, I got myself a job and got myself a flat, but I went on my travels for a bit. I went to America when I was 20 years old, looking to live that rock and roll dream. Started in New York. But then I began roadieing I ended up in Colorado and started roadieing for a band there who kind of took me in as one of their own. And I started to learn to play guitar and sing the odd song on stage with the band. So I kind of pursued that journey for a bit. And I didn't really work a straight job for, must have been about 10 years. I played in bands and stuff like that. I didn't go near the gym. Experimented with drugs and got myself into a few problems there with all that. That's all part of that mythology as well. And I didn't find my way back into boxing until I was in New York in 2002, tail end of 2002. I had a girlfriend back in London who I was living with in the Clerkenwell, Angel, Islington kind of area, who liked boxing. And we'd started to go to a few shows in London, where I hadn't been for years. And I found how much I'd missed the scene. And I still knew a lot of people in the scene and recognised a lot of people. So then we went to New York, long story short. We went to see the second Arturo Gatti Mickey Ward fight, which is, to be fair, it's probably the least classic of the whole classic trilogy, but it was still an amazing fight, and it was something which kick-started me back into the boxing. So, having seen that fight in Atlantic City on November the 23rd, 2002, I walked into Gleason's gym on the Monday afterwards, and Paul Malignaggi, who you'll probably be known to you these days, at the time he was an unknown kid who was 12-0, who boxed on the undercard of that show. And I'd seen him and recognised him from that. And we had a chat. I said, saw you box like your star, man, and sort of struck up a friendship. And when I started training, long story short, I started sparring with some of the pros in there, including Malignaggi. Now, one of the things that goes on with some of my social media detractors is Paulie doesn't remember me. I've met him since on the circuit, and he doesn't remember me because I look different. I had hair, all the rest of it, and he just doesn't remember. But some people say I made it all up. You know, you can find words on Twitter saying, "Oh, you know, he's just a serial liar." But the thing is, I can't do anything about it, and Madeline, I can't prove it. But I sparred Malinaji, a few other guys like Dimitri Solito, Vivian Harris, whatnot. I had an amateur fight out there at the gym in Brooklyn. They'd have gym shows actually in Gleason's gym, and I lost on points. But because I hadn't been in a ring for over 12 years, it was a close fight, and some people thought I won it. The way people said, "Oh, you won that, mate. You got robbed." But I felt good to be back, you know. So I came back to London not too long after that, and had a few more amateur fights for the Angel Boxing Club in Islington, and then I went into training. I did a year of coaching at Angel. Then I went to the famous Repton in Bethnal Green for 3 years. After that, I went to a commercial gym, like a white-collar type gym, where I met Spencer Fearon, who's quite well known in the whole boxing social media loop, and until recently worked for Sky, and he's one of those kind of charismatic faces of the scene. And it was after that I stopped training the amateurs and got a professional license to train fighters. And I've worked with a few over the years. To be honest with you, I've grown away from it a little more. I didn't realise the power of social media until it happened, really, to be honest with you. I took Spencer's lead to an extent. I saw he was filming himself with his phone and broadcasting straight to YouTube. Because we were in the gym, and because I was in the gym with quite a few well-known fighters, I suddenly realised you could make media content out of nothing. I remember the Trailblazers were IFL TV. They were at the press conferences interviewing fighters and trainers and whatnot when nobody else was doing it. And obviously they become absolutely massive, and I think they deserve that, and they've done a fantastic job, and they've spawned 1,000 imitators. But for me, I kind of followed that direction a bit more, and organically, I was less of a trainer really, and more of a social. It was more about PT and the social media side of it. You know, at one point I worked for Boxing Social, and think I did quite a lot to help launch that company, and I've kind of pressed on with it. You know, I've had my trials and tribulations over the years, but I basically forged a path. You know, a path on my own, really, with a mixture of training, boxing, reportage, interviews, and whatnot.
Yeah, I think you're right about social media there. Obviously, like these days, you don't have to have all the video equipment and all the cameras and and a whole crew to make content. You know, as we're doing now. You know, it's me and you. And you can get graphics, and all I've got is some lighting and a webcam and a laptop, basically.
Yeah.
And you can make content which looks good. And as long as the content's interesting, and it's well done, people will watch it. You don't have to have those, the camera crews which you would have had to have had, 15, 20 years ago. Social media's changed the game.
It's been empowering. It's been empowering, and I think what it's shown to me is if you have something to say and you can attract enough people who are interested in what you have to say and what you have to contribute, then you're up and running, really. Because it's like the Facebook. My Facebook page became popular probably within about 18 months. I remember I was always trying to replicate what Spencer Fearon had achieved. We're getting loads of comments on boxing-related threads, and I'd get 6 men and a dog if I was lucky commenting at first, because that's just the way things are until you keep plugging away. And then I remember the thread that blew up for me was about should Sylvester Stallone be inducted into the Hall of Fame. So God bless Sly for that, for the controversy around it, because I just noticed my phone was beeping away and I had a couple of hundred comments, and I thought, okay, this is what I was trying to achieve. And to be honest with you, as far as Facebook goes, I've never really looked back since then. Now, the thing with Facebook, you can't monetize it directly, but but it monetizes in a variety of other ways, because I found that Facebook, it gave me that credibility, and it gave me those connections with people on both sides of the Atlantic in boxing. It's allowed me to do a lot of things, including big fight trips across the pond and to Monte Carlo or Dusseldorf, whatever. And it's kind of made me somebody to an extent where people recognise you as supposedly being an authority. And it was, it was something that it's self-empowering. It's something that I've become friends with guys like Tim Witherspoon, and it wouldn't have happened without social media. So I think there are negative aspects to social media, and I think there are things that the hardcore fans miss about the old school class of BBC coverage or HBO coverage. And the idea that any fool can't just yell whatever comes into his goddamn head, as long as he might be called a Hara Davies or something, or Tyson Fury at that moment. But I think in the old days, stars, moderate stars or big stars, they only spoke and you only heard them if the media wanted to ask them something and wanted to broadcast their response. Now anybody has that power, don't they? Whether they're a star or whether they're a marginal figure, we all have that same, technically, that lowest common denominator broadcasting opportunity, which, it's been good and bad, no doubt. But I'll be honest, Simon, I wouldn't go back. As much as I may prefer boxing the way it used to be in the 1980s when I go up, and I could justify to you a whole bunch of reasons why I think it was a better, healthier scene, I wouldn't go back, because I love the ability and the power of to communicate on social media more than I love checking results on teletext, or waiting for boxing news to come out sometimes before you even knew who won a fight,
Yeah, oh, definitely. Like social media, like you say, there's a lot of negatives to it. I had my first troll the other day for the podcast where someone was targeting the page with comments and abuse.
Yeah.
And in the end, I private messaged them as well, and I said, look, whatever your issue is, I'm happy to discuss, but I don't really want it on the podcast page. So can you not do it? And they basically said, I'm going to keep doing it. You're going to have to ban me. And I was like, well, I've got like nearly 9,000 followers. I've never had to ban anyone from the page. I welcome everybody's opinion as long as it's respectful. I don't really want to go down that route. And I was, trying to diffuse it or whatever. And they were like, no, I'm going to keep doing it. And so I left it, and then they did it again. So I had to ban them. And I thought, well, all right, whatever. It's the negative side to it. Unfortunately, there is a large number of people, particularly on Twitter, I find, who seem to thrive.
Oh, it's toxic as fuck, Twitter, isn't it?
Oh yeah,
Twitter is toxic as hell.
I used to spend a lot of time on Twitter, just on my personal account, just talking to friends.
Yeah.
And I've met some of couple of my best friends I met through Twitter, but I've got a couple of other lads who I met through Twitter who I'm really good friends with. They've helped me through some tough times, just through chatting on DMs, and they've sorted my head out and stuff. But the negativity. So now I only really use it to promote the podcast, because I just can't handle it. It's the cancel culture is the thing which really gets to me, because it's like this thing that it's like you can't make a mistake, or if you do make a mistake, that means you've got to lose everything: your marriage, your job, your car, just everything.
Do you know? It's funny, Simon. I was talking about this today, right? Because we've seen people get hung out to dry on Twitter for a silly broadcast. Like we had the Billy Joe Saunders thing recently. You got the Devin Haney gate where he said, I'd never lose to a white boy, and people are up in arms. Now, I do think social responsibility is a part of it, and I think that words can be damaging because in terms of the thought patterns they might lead to and the behaviours they might lead to. But to be honest with you, I was thinking, I don't know if you've noticed or you've seen it, but there was a recent-ish documentary, sorry, not documentary, a drama, a kind of serialised drama about Carlos Monzon and the murder of his wife, the great Argentine.
It's on my list to watch.
I would recommend it, although there is elements of faction about it. I mean, it's probably romanced a lot, and if somebody knew a lot about the case, I suspect they'd be picking holes in it all the time, or they knew a lot about Monzon's career. But I do think it's very, very, very good viewing. And I was thinking, Monzon, I always thought Monzon killed his wife in 1988, several years retired, because they had a drunken argument and they were rowing on the balcony of an apartment in Mar del Plata in Argentina. And I thought they both fell off the balcony. He was pushing her and whatever, and the balcony gave way. What seems more likely, certainly the preferred version of events that you will read about and what you'll see depicted very graphically in the Netflix series, is he strangled her to death in rage because she wouldn't bend to his will, or she was telling him we'd never see his kid again, and she was trying to get more money out of him, whatever. So he's killed her by strangulation, supposedly. Then he's thrown her off the balcony, we're encouraged to believe. And at some point he's dove off the balcony himself to try and make it perhaps look like a mutual fall. He's probably in some kind of alcoholic blackout, perhaps. Yes. But what I was thinking was Carlos Monzon is still highly revered, especially in boxing circles. His reputation hasn't suffered at all in boxing circles. There's reasonable evidence that he was possibly a serial spousal abuser. He definitely appears to have murdered his wife, Alicia Muniz. but nobody minds, nobody cares. And I was saying to a mate of mine today, I said, we compartmentalise, with this kind of thing. But in today's era, I mean, Billy Joe is being hung out to dry. He's had his license suspended for making a very tasteless, silly video saying, "All right, lads, if the missus if her indoors is giving you any earache, this is how you hit her. You hit right cross, dip left hook." Now, don't get me wrong, I think it was silly, and I know Billy Joe quite well. I consider him a friend, and when I speak to him about it, I would say, "Have you got rocks in your head or something? How can you not know that was going to react? Rebound very badly on you?" But what I'm saying is, there's no perspective. Carlos Monzon is still utterly revered, and it's really not a thing that he was a murderer and a spousal abuser. Whereas today, like you say on Twitter, I mean, Umar from IFL TV, what did he say? That they dug up old tweets of him calling Tyson Fury a crackhead when he was probably about 15, and he was being a bit of a troll himself, and he got taken off the channel from that. I don't know if he's back in this. This would be the ideal time to bring anyone back, I'd imagine. When they talk about you bury news, and it's this is when you release, things you don't want people to take any notice of. But you know what I mean? Yeah, like you said, cancel culture. It seems out of all proportion, doesn't it?
Oh God, yeah. I am absolutely ecstatic that there is. When I was 13 to say 19, there was no such thing as the internet, camera phones, and social media. Because I would have never been able to get a job anywhere. Because I said stupid shit all the time.
Yeah.
I did stupid shit all the time. I was fighting, I was drinking, doing plenty of other things, which I shouldn't have been doing. And I was saying offensive, horrible stuff. As a kid, I didn't really grasp the meaning of words and how they can affect other people, how they can affect people, what words mean historically. It's kind of one of those things. So I'm ecstatic about it, and it does bring a whole new aspect to parenting as well. I think, like, I've got 2 teenage boys, and then another one who's 11, and I've got to not only you've got to bring them up and try and make them into to grow up to be good human beings, good men, respectful, treat women the right way, etc. But also you've got to also teach them to protect themselves on social media from shady, dodgy people who are targeting teenage boys and girls on social media and different apps. Then you've got to also teach them that once you put something on the internet, it's there forever.
It's there for good.
Even if you delete it.
Yeah, because like the Danny Baker thing, which had him, put in the long grass after he had that very successful radio show. But I mean, I thought that was bizarre once again. I mean, you scratch your head again and think, well, how could you have done that, and how could you not have known? But I remember him deleting it, and obviously it doesn't make any difference because people have got it at that point.
No. Yeah, and I think I find it going back to Umar. I find it really problematic if we're going to start holding 13, 14, 15-year-olds accountable for stuff they said when they were 15, when they're then 25 and they're in a job just because they've worked hard and got a really good job, or they've come to prominence. But then we're going to kind of make them lose that because they said some stupid shit when they were 15. I find that really problematic because there's not one person on this planet who's never made a mistake. There's not one person who didn't do stupid shit when they were younger, whether it was saying something or doing something. It's part of growing up. The best way to learn is to learn from mistakes rather than someone telling you, this is how you do something. You learn so much more about yourself, about growing up, and about things if you try it for yourself and make a mistake. Now, it kind of is what it is. I wanted to pick your brain, actually, something you mentioned about the boxer, what's his name? Devin
Haney,
Yeah, Devin Haney. So this was, it was quite ironic for me personally and for us as a channel, because on last week's Danny Batten show, which came out yesterday, we did the Joe Calzaghe versus Bernard Hopkins fight. And the week before we did the Roy Jones Jr. fight. So in the Bernard Hopkins build-up, I didn't realise at the time, because it was so long ago for me. I was a kid really when the fight took place. In the build-up, Bernard Hopkins said the same thing, or if not the same, something along the same lines. If not,
said exactly the same thing.
Now, when me and Danny discussed it, like, I don't have a problem really with what either of them said in terms of boxers say stuff to hype fights, to hype themselves. I've got no problem with that. My kind of issue with it, I suppose, is if Joe Calzaghe had said the reverse, he probably would have been suspended and this, that, and the other. And I just think that that's like a bit hypocritical, because to me, I've said this a lot recently, is racism is racism, regardless of what race has said the racist thing. It's still racism. If you discriminate against someone because of the colour of their skin, then it's racism. If you discriminate against someone because of their gender, it's whatever it is.
But I'm a little bit different on that. I don't understand it, but to me that's the obvious logic. But I'm a little bit different on that because, first of all, that is just a Black American cultural thing. Some people said, "Oh, that's a cop out," but I don't. Here's my thing: if you've ever been to any American gyms, urban gyms that are full of Black and Latin fighters, they don't expect certainly white American guys to be able to fight because they haven't. Nobody has significantly been able to do that since Kelly Pavlik, and even that they're few and far between. Ray Mancini, and to go to a rich talent pool of white American fighters wherever they were from ethnically, generations before, you'd have to go back to the days of Marciano and LaMotta, or the golden 20s like Benny Leonard and Jack Kid Berg and that kind of era. Mm-hmm. So they've had a long running joke in America before the Eastern European uprising, but when more of them were allowed to turn professional, they had this kind of almost never bet on the white guy. That was a running joke in America for a long time. Certainly, they thought black fighters fight differently in a different style, with the Afro-American kind of style with more rhythm, and you're kind of Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Leonard influenced, and then evolving through to Floyd Mayweather and his shoulder roll and all the rest of it. So there are certain cultural presumptions about white fighters and black fighters in America, certainly more so than there is over here, where we've got more of a kind of melting pot, I think, because we're a smaller country. So you will find that if you're a white guy in the gym, and I've experienced it myself, they don't expect you to be able to hold your hands up. If you can, and you take your lumps and you acquit yourself well in sparring and you show that you've got skills, then they'll warm to you. But they will. I mean, one guy actually said to me when I was training in New York, he said, "I see you spar the other day." He said, "You don't fight like a white guy. You got some skills, B." And I appreciated it and got a kick out of it. But that is where they're coming from, Now, when people say it's racism, it's obviously, to be honest, it's just very misguided for him to say it, because Vasyl Lomachenko would beat him, 10 times out of 10, I believe, unlike, his claim to the opposite. But because white Russians are different to what the white American male probably has generally gone soft and lost the plot as far as boxing goes decades ago. I think there's massive amount of evidence for that. But don't play these white Russians and Ukrainians cheap, because they are probably the boxing superpower right now if you go down through the divisions. And the reasons for that are obvious, and it is cultural. People who are races do seem to go through generic trends of when they're harder and more working class and more pugnacious as a race. We've seen it with the Jews and the Italians. You don't see great Jewish fighters anymore, but you used to, So anyway, what I would say is, do you think it's racist when black people say we can't dance? White people can't dance, or you're trying, but you guys, So, to be honest with you, that I feel that prejudice that white guys can't fight based on why Bob Arum said it once to an American boxing magazine called KO Magazine. He said, "You magazines are out of touch. You don't realise the talent which is waiting to break through from the behind the Iron Curtain, and it will happen." He said in the next 15, 20 years. He said, "You keep saying that white guys can't fight." He said, "White American guys can't fight. White Russian guys can." And that's what it comes down to. But their prejudice that, I'd never lose to a white boy. I'm not trying to come on like I'm some honorary black guy or anything like that, but I have lived in Harlem. I have lived in areas of Brooklyn as well on my travels. And when I say lived, I mean I've stayed there for months and whatnot. Spanish Harlem, West Harlem. And I understand it. It's a very normal thing to be, ain't no white boy beating me. I don't, and I think, to be honest with you, if a black guy says it, I do think it's ugly. Alan Minter is supposed to have said, "I will never lose the title to a black man," ahead of the Marvin Hagler fight, which, as you may be aware, he was pretty much a sacrificial lamb in that particular fight. So it came back on him karmically and rather immediately, savagely. But, some people dislike Minter to this day because they'll dig that quote up. Oh, he said that. And he wore Union Jack underpants at the weigh-in, which was seen as a kind of... And there's another debate, isn't it? It's St. George's Day today, and to some extent, our Union flag and our national flag have been demonised because they seem to have racist connotations, which some people would say, well, that's wrong as well. But I understand why David Haney said it, because I understand where he's coming from. I realise, and to be honest, no, if a white guy said it, it would have an uglier context for me. I know some
Yeah.
people are going to say, Ben, that doesn't make sense. That's my take on it, rather long-winded as it may have been.
No, I like that, and I got to say that your input into that and your kind of your view on it does make me look at it slightly different. But like I said right at the start, I didn't have a problem with with the either guy saying it was not an issue for me. But like you say, maybe there is a slightly different connotation if it's in reverse. I'm not sure. So just before we get into the questions of the people, we'll do the quickfire questions. So basically, it's just 10 questions, and then you will just say basically the first thing which comes to mind as we go through them. And they're not necessarily all boxing; they're just kind of a bit random. So first one, quickfire questions. First one is biggest pet peeve or irritation.
To be honest with you, as generic as the answer is going to be, I think lack of thought, lack of ability to reason about something intelligently, and lack of ability to examine. People who knee-jerk, who believe whatever they hear, read, people who subscribe to cliche points of view. It's probably the most annoying thing when I think people just seem literally incapable of any reasoning process. It annoys me. I know it can be so many forms I'm going to find it in, but that's probably the thing that annoys me more than anything is ignorance and being misunderstood. Like I say,
I like that. That's I think that could possibly be my favourite answer to that question yet. Most painful feeling in the world.
physically, there must be more painful feelings I've not experienced. But when you get hit with a body shot, any fighter will tell you, and I don't know many that have been around for any amount of time who haven't experienced it. There's something crippling about getting punctured with a body shot. It takes all the air out of you. You feel like you can't breathe, and you're just not getting up. That is about as bad as anything. I know that there must be pain that people have experienced that's worse than that. Because the thing is, the body shot, you will get over that within 30 seconds to an extent, as long as the fight doesn't continue. If that's you done. But that was my first response.
Yeah, a friend of mine who's an MMA journalist, he describes being kicked in the kind of the ribs and the lower stomach area as the pant shitter kick, because he said there's nothing worse than being punched or kicked kind of in that lower, like the liver area. Oasis or the Beatles?
That's a good question. I'm going to say the Beatles because of their more seminal impact on the history of pop music and rock and roll. I think you wouldn't have got one without the other. I went through a Beatles phase when I was in Colorado, roadieing for that band and hustling my way around Boulder and Denver. I went through that Beatles phase of listening to all their songs. I took LSD as well, thinking that was a good idea because it had that kind of intellectual context and artistic context to it because they did it, etc. And Jim Morrison did it too. And I got into the genius of Lennon and McCartney when I was younger, and I was analysing the songs the way so many people have, critics and musicians and etc. and fans. And I do think there is something very fascinating about them. Them four lads from Liverpool. I think you think about them if you're into music. You think about, and you've ever been in a band and been young and stupid yourself. You think about them in leather clad in Hamburg, playing every night of the week. Out their box on Proliferation and Cheap Speed. Shagging everything that moved that came their way, all the groupies, and you think, playing on them rock and roll covers, learning how to become rock stars and singers. It does sound rather idyllic for a young man, doesn't it? So I'm going to say the Beatles.
Yeah. Absolutely. You mentioned Jim Morrison there. I'm going to circle back to that in a minute because he's one of my all-time heroes. Best TV show of all time.
I really like, just as a TV show, I really like Minder. I'll be honest. Classic Minder, not with Ray. No disrespect to that fella, Ray, and the actor who played him. I've met the actor a couple of times randomly in Richmond, and he seems a lovely bloke. But Terry McCann era Minder, I'm going to say.
Classic. Best movie of all time.
I really like A Clockwork Orange by Stanley Kubrick, which was withdrawn for many years in this country and you couldn't see it. And things keep, quite organically, things keep going back to my first American trip. I saw that in Denver in 1990 as well because you couldn't watch it here. And I just thought it was stunning. The language, the Nadsat language was very poetic. The story was just very, very it really got my attention. The idea of this despicable behaviour that Alex was indulging in, but the lead character was so attractive, so intelligent, articulate, and attractive, and kind of sexy, you know. So I think that takes some beating for me as a creative effort. I think A Clockwork Orange was an amazing film.
Another classic, yeah, it's very good. But yeah, it was banned for years, wasn't it, in the UK?
Yep.
Most famous person in your phone contacts?
Let me think. It might be Joe Calzaghe, and to be fair to Joe, he always picks up. I've got Tim Witherspoon as well, but it depends where, doesn't it? I mean, Tim Witherspoon is a pretty famous. I've got a lot of boxing people. I'm thinking the most famous. It might be Joe Calzaghe. Is there anybody else who's more famous than that? I got Prince Nassim Hamed's number, but I've never phoned him, and he doesn't know me. So I'm going to say Joe because I'm going to say Joe because he has picked up the phone whenever I've called. Yeah.
Excellent. Favorite thing in your wardrobe currently?
Let me think. Probably like a grey jacket with kind of black suede kind of lapels with trim. It's probably my favourite one. Yeah.
Lennox Lewis or Tyson Fury?
I think as a personality, Tyson Fury is a more attractive person, charismatic person, sort of more the sort of person if I was still drinking, I'd want to go for a beer with. Mm-hmm. But Lennox Lewis, I think, is a greater heavyweight with a better body of work for now. I mean, it's incredible what Tyson did on his comeback and the job he did on Deontay Wilder last time. But I think in terms of a kind of great heavyweight, you're still talking about Lennox Lewis for the time being.
And in your opinion, the greatest British boxer of all time?
Interesting question, Simon. Your modern guys like Lennox Lewis, I know some people have got an issue with him being British, but he was born in West Ham. As far as I'm concerned, he's British. Lennox has a claim. Joe Calzaghe has a claim, his undefeated record and his relative quality of opposition. Some people say Joe was protected or kept on the leash for a little bit too long, and he had some of those career-defining fights when the guys were a little bit past it. Certainly, Roy Jones was a shadow of himself. Even Joe admits he might not have beaten a peak Roy Jones. Joe has a claim, certainly. I think old school guys like Ted Kid Lewis Ted Kid Lewis has an amazing record. See, it's hard for the modern era guys to compete with the old veterans because they had so many fights, and they're the ones who are good, who had the longevity. Their resume, like guys like Harry Greb across the pond, their resume reads like some giant killing mythological book rather than a boxing record, because there was none of that kind of more savvy kind of steering fighters that goes on today. So, I think it might be Ted Kid Lewis, to be honest with you, in terms of his record. I think it might trump Joe Calzaghe or any more recent guys like Lewis.
Okay, cool. So they were the quickfire questions. We're going to move into the people's questions now. But just before we do, Unscripted and Uncensored, much like Ace Podcast Nation, is sponsored by Away Day Apparel. Away Day Apparel is fast becoming the go-to brand on the casual scene. With their exciting plans, clever designs, they're definitely a brand to watch. All their clothing is reasonably priced, while also using top quality materials that are also good for the environment. Visit awaydayapparel.co.uk for their latest designs. Follow them on social media to keep up to date with their plans going forward. On Instagram, you can find them at awayday_apparel, and on Twitter, they're at awaydayapparel. Especially for listeners and viewers of Ace Podcast Nation, if you use the code AA Podcast Nation, all in lowercase, you can get 10% off all orders. That's AA Podcast Nation, all in lowercase, 10% off all orders if you use that at the till. And we thank them for sponsoring the show and indeed the channel. So just something I want to, before we go into the people's questions, and I just looked at the time, I cannot believe we've done 45 minutes already. That's flown by.
Yeah.
But I know we said an hour. Would you be all right to go a little bit longer if we don't get through the questions, or have you got to finish up? It's up to you.
I'm kind of self-isolating really. So I mean, the kids come over once a fortnight at the minute. The lovely lady is sequestered in Plaistow, so I'm kind of stuck here with you anyhow. So that's good.
Excellent. All right, so we can kind of just move through it and talk as we're going.
Whatever you want.
But if you get to a point and you need to kind of knock it on the edge, just give me a nod.
No
I'll take this little bit out anyway. But okay, so yeah, we mentioned in the quickfire questions there Tyson Fury, and I was wondering if you could really talk to me about how difficult it is or was for Tyson Fury to have the mental health problems that he had, the addiction problems that he had, get to the size that he got to, and then come back and fight at the level that he's fought since he's come back. Because to me, I look at some of those pictures of him, and just the pictures alone, like the size of him and the shape of him, and just he looked rough. And I look at that and I think, Jesus, how the hell did he not only get himself well and clean and back in shape, but he's also, the linear world champion. It's incredible to me. But obviously, you will know better than me the amount of effort and work and heartache he would have gone through to get there.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, but just to be clear on that linear world champion tag, the whole thing with that is he was that no matter what. The contentious claim made by the people who believe in that tag was that even though he was went up to 40 stone or whatever, I exaggerate no doubt, and had issues and had his license lifted and was doing cocaine and was having mental health problems. People were saying he was still the champion purely because he beat Klitschko in Dusseldorf at the tail end of 2015. And they insisted he returned as champion. I didn't quite see it that way. I think that he had dropped the ball to an extent, although he'd been railroaded as well, and there's certain things certain things were not entirely fair the way he was dealt with by the sanctioning bodies, and whatnot. But I didn't regard him. For me, he had to come back and regain a version of the title, which he did. Again, I think I was at the first fight in Los Angeles with Wilder, and I do think he won that night, like most people did, despite the 2 knockdowns. Although I do think it was relatively close. I don't think it was a robbery because of those knockdowns. But for me, Tyson regained a status as a world heavyweight champion. Obviously, still sharing that kind of argument with Anthony Joshua at the minute, who regained his titles from Ruiz. But that's when he became champion for me. I didn't go with the lineal thing, but for those reasons. But I think it is amazing what he's done. He's clearly a very extraordinary character who has an awful lot of. I think he's a child of whim, and when he believes in himself, there's no stopping him. I think he is a bit of a child of destiny as well, if you believe in that kind of thing. And I think it's something he's just trampled everything in its wake and kind of taken over the world, really. And there was something so incredible about seeing him sing that Don McLean song in the ring after. I don't know anybody who's ever dreamed of Fistic Glory who didn't want to be Tyson Fury at that moment, especially if you wanted to be a singer as well, rock star or a world champion, and you weren't quite sure which way to go. To see him say, "Oh, I said I'd do a song, didn't I?" So, and he launches into that. And when he's singing that line, "I know that you're in love with him," he looks at Paris and changes it to, "I know that I'm in love with you." And you think, well, if your whole life doesn't crystallize at that moment and make you think, "Fuck yes, this is living," like few people ever will, And he's an incredible character. And he also showed, because people didn't believe him when he said he was going to be aggressive and he was going to basically beat Wilder up and he was going to go to him. I thought that was a blind. I thought it was typical Tyson Fury kidology, and he actually went and did it. And it was right. I know Ben Davidson to an extent. I know him from the gym, and always had a high opinion of his coaching and his acumen, even though some people thought he was a Johnny come lately. But for whatever reason, it was right. But the Kronk move paid off well for Tyson. The more aggressive approach, and he showed that Wilder couldn't fight when a guy took it to him, and he took away Wilder's advantages and momentum, And I was one of those people who didn't believe we'd see Tyson Fury in a ring again. I thought he's put on too much weight. He's been inactive too long. I don't think he wants to do it. I mean, his uncle Peter Fury told me, various times that I might have seen him, that he didn't say much, but he basically said, reading between the lines, he's not in a good way, and he's just, who knows if he'll box again. And I do think it's an incredible comeback. I think somebody said about Ali one time. Norman Mailer said it. He said, what a wall of ego Ali's will has erected over the years when he was observing him in the build-up to the Foreman fight. And I think there was some of that about Tyson Fury, that idea that a wall of ego has erected you to will anything that you say shall come to pass. You might recall in the post-fight interview, he said, "I said those who use weapons against me shall not prosper." And there is something almost fatalistic about Tyson Fury's rise, fall, and reprise.
Yeah, absolutely. Like him winning and then the singing and that moment in particular, that to me encapsulates these kinds of moments that fight the boxing or MMA and sport generally. They they just give you these moments where it's difficult not to get into and really feel the emotion, and I think sport does that more than anything else. We regularly see these emotional moments that capture you, whether you're in the stadium or whether you're watching at home, watching alone or watching with friends or watching in the pub. Wherever you will be watching, they just capture the emotion and it can get to you. So as soon as we kind of opened the door, or I opened the door to AJ and to Fury, and obviously we've had a couple of questions regarding Fury and AJ. But just before that, I wanted to ask you a question, because we just talked about Tyson's Fury his battle with mental health. And this was a question from me, really. I do like a mental health in sports series, which I haven't done. I haven't done an episode for a while, but we did a few. And one of the things which often comes up is how professional athletes struggle when they do have to retire. And particularly boxers and fighters do seem to have this big struggle upon retirement. Not all of them, obviously, but there is a large number which do seem to have this struggle to come to terms with retiring. And then we often see boxers coming back, like age 50 and looking a shadow of their former selves, and sometimes their legacies can be damaged in the process because they're nowhere near the level that they perhaps were 20 years previous, for obvious reasons. Why do you think that so many athletes, but boxers in particular, struggle with retirement and the mental health side of it when they do retire?
Because I think boxing, most of them tend to take it up at a young age, and it tends to be the ultimate definition of who they are as a person. And if anything, they become, while it might be character building in some ways and it gives them a routine and discipline, when that framework is taken away, it seems meaningless. I know some fighters remain fitness freaks in their retirement, like Jim McDonnell, and I think those people are quite blessed. Some of them go the other way; they really can't be bothered, and perhaps they dive headlong into vices with the same zeal they used to dive into that monastic training. So I think for some fighters, it's not enough just the gym or hitting the bag, ticking over. I know Marvin Hagler would said he'd stay out the gym because he didn't want to get the smell again of liniment, and the taste of it, because he knew otherwise his retirement might not be final. He'd be in danger of coming back and, like you say, compromising his legacy and putting himself in a position where he wouldn't do himself justice compared to the fantastic career that he had. So I think sometimes all meaning is taken out of a fighter's life. They miss the camaraderie of the gym too. They miss the thrill of boxing, the adulation to which nothing else compares, as Sugar Ray Leonard said. Sugar Ray Leonard had a bunch of retirements, and he confessed to drinking alcoholically, to using cocaine, because he couldn't find that fix that he got when his name was up in lights on the strip, and he had that supreme one-on-one competition, mano-mano kind of thing going on, and the battle with himself. So, I mean, Ray Leonard, when he embarrassed himself against Terry Norris to an extent, and even more so in 1997 against Hector Camacho, when I did my first interview with Ray Leonard in 2012, he said, I came back because I felt more stable in the ring. He said, I felt safe in the ring. And I said to him, the irony is, although it's a dangerous occupation, for many fighters, the ring remains a relative place of safety. And he said, without question, So I think they just get their whole... One of the problems, Simon, is you can't keep doing it, can you? If you happen to be a quantity surveyor, I guess you can kind of do that to your 60-odd retirement age, and you can do a lot of jobs that you're good at, and you have a certain amount of job security. You can continue to do it. Necessarily, and by definition, the athlete's life and the fighter's life is shorter. And I also think the aftercare is probably not as good. People tell me footballers have much better aftercare. probably because that sport can afford it. To be honest with you, I've got mixed feelings about aftercare because part of me, they say, oh, we should be doing more for ex-fighters. We should be having whip rounds. We should be doing testimonials. Part of me thinks, you know what? That's life. That's the food chain. You used to be a boxer. You're not anymore. Get over it. You got to go out and work for a living. If you didn't make enough money while you were fighting, or I mean, I hope you didn't get robbed. I know that some of them certainly did. You know what I mean? I don't want to be harsh, and I'd do anything for a fighter because I was a boxer too, and that's my community, and I do what I can for fighters who've been on hard times. But part of me feels like saying, well, okay, you used to be a boxer, that moves on, and you have to fight. I find some of the happier fighters, like guys like John H. Tracy and John Conte, are the ones who've kind of left it behind, Simon. They know they were world champions and they remember it and they don't mind talking about it, but they have moved on in their life. They don't live in that space where I get the impression they're not shadowboxing every day, you know what I mean? Things like that. Whereas some fighters, the ones who didn't get to the mountaintop and they feel that perhaps somebody else was to blame for that, you know, sometimes that goes on. I think they can't really leave it behind. But, I mean, you know, even fighters who did get to the mountaintop, like Ricky Hatton and Frank Bruno, we've seen them have struggles and issues with substances as well. I do think it because it's such an all-consuming thing to be a boxer, even though I wasn't a pro, I've had an insight into that. Listen, I know people who had a few amateur fights that stopped as a junior, but they had 60 amateur fights. And in their head, that's still the best thing they ever did. And they've never left it alone for one day. And to them, they are still a boxer. That is what defines them, whether people agree with them or not, whether they say you didn't turn pro. In their minds, they are a boxer, you know. So I think it never leaves some people. And because they can't, it has to end somewhere. They don't handle it well, you know. And if you also happen to be you know, in financial hardship, that makes it even worse. Although, as I say, guys like Sugar Ray Leonard and Ricky Hatton earned plenty of money, and they still struggled.
Yeah, of course. Do you think that maybe if boxing as a whole encouraged former fighters when they retire to maybe train to be judges, to be referees, to be involved within the sport on an official level, this would reduce the amount of maybe cases where fighters are struggling to come to terms with their retirement, but also improve, you know, the judging and the refereeing and the.
I think, I think that we could have better kind of channels for absorbing ex-fighters into the sport. The only thing I would say as a caveat is there's no money in boxing except at the very top, as you can imagine. We have a very kind of capitalist pyramid in boxing, where for the matchrooms in the promotional side and the Bob Arums and the Floyd Mayweathers on the fighting side at the sharp end of it, they seem to get all the money and there's very little that filters down through. So in terms of saying why don't you become a referee or a judge, there's only so many referees and judges you can have and jobs you can have in that way that's going to sustain somebody more than a hobby for a lot, you know, for a lot of people. Even judges like Bob Williams, you know, who does a lot of the fights on TV, certainly in this country, works for the fire service, and you know, a lot of them have day jobs. So same thing with coaching. When they go into coaching, a lot of fighters go into training fighters. Obviously, not all of them are good at it, though, you know. And would it improve the quality of judging if more ex-fighters? Some people are going to have an issue with judges, aren't they? Saying the guy's never taken a punch in his life, and he has in his hands the destiny and the financial future and security of certain fighters with the decisions he makes. And we've seen some crazy verdicts. Some people think it's bent, and some people think the promoters bribed them. You know, give them the famous, you know, white envelopes metaphor or brown envelopes. Some people think that there's just an automatic desire to favour the promoter's fighter and to the house fighter because that's just the way life is. Barry Hearn once said it to me. You know, when people thought Erislandy Lara beat Saul Canelo Alvarez back in 2014, he said, you know, yes, but, you know, Alvarez is the bigger commercial animal, isn't he? And he said, you know, I'm not saying it's crooked, but there's a natural tendency to veer towards the bigger commercial animal. So, generally, I would be... See, this is the thing, Simon. I don't always think that fighters know more about things. They know more about the physical side of boxing. They don't always make better trainers than guys who never boxed, because you got guys like Angelo Di Costamato and Ray Arcel who never boxed. You get guys like Lloyd Hunnigan who did. And would you believe this? Lloyd Hunnigan managed to fail the ABA Part 1 coaching course. I don't know. It's part of local London boxing folklore that he failed the ABA Level 1. I don't know how he managed that or who assessed him. But what I'm saying is, not all ex-boxers would make better judges. I think sometimes I know people who've never boxed in their life who are very good judges of boxing. They're good historians. They've got some world-class fighters talk a lot of rubbish. They've got no historical perspective, and some of them they don't know. They know about them boxing and they know what they did, but they haven't necessarily got a fantastic knowledge base beyond that, the realm of what they did when they were in the ring and what worked for them. So, having said that, I would genuinely be happier with ex-boxers, having been through the same course as other judges go through. I think we could improve judging with more ex-boxers in it, yeah. Probably.
Yeah, I think, funny enough, something you mentioned there, all the different fighters I've had on, whether they be boxers or MMA fighters, one thing which does stick out to me is that they don't always follow boxing as a sport generally.
No.
Or they don't, or MMA generally. They concentrate on their stuff,
them,
and who their next opponent is, or their upcoming opponents, or who they would like to face. Who's got a belt maybe, but they're not. They don't, sit down like the rest of us every Saturday and tune in for the boxing and the MMA and this, and that surprised me to a certain extent. Because I kind of always assumed, they must love,
they'd be obsessed,
they must be obsessed with it. But they are obsessed with it, but they're obsessed with success and they're obsessed with achieving their goals, not necessarily
fans,
other fighters and etc. So
you raise a great point. I think you raise a great point because it struck me when I was hanging around the Thomas a Beckett gym in the 1980s. You say that they focus on their opponents and who they're fighting. Sometimes not even. The guy called Prince Rodney, who was British light middleweight champion, he beat Jimmy Batten for the title, and then he defended it, I believe, at least once, and then he was sidelined because of injury, and a guy called Jimmy Cable won the title in his stead. He fought a guy called Mick Courtney for his vacant title. It was live on BBC One back in the day when British title fight was still a BBC One kind of midweek primetime affair. And I asked him what did he think of it, thinking it was a given he'd seen it, and he said he didn't watch it. Now, me and my dad thought that was incredible, that these are the guys fighting for your title that should, that you're going to be, as soon as you're well again, you're going to be fighting the winner. And he hadn't even watched it. And it went on. There was guys who didn't know who the top 10 were in, in their particular division, things like that, hadn't seen certain fighters. So what you've got to bear in mind is some fighters don't like to watch their opponents. Some of them, psychologically, they don't want to go there, especially if the guy looks good. They prefer to say, listen, I'll react to what he does. My trainer can watch it. He'll tell me what to do. I trust him. Some fighters, much as you might find it strange, they don't like to watch their opponents. Some of them, on the other hand, they like to see anything they can get. The psyches of prize fighters are very individual and very complex. So, and as you said, over and above their own fights and their own opponents on the horizon, some of them are not big fans of the sport. I remember Sugar Ray Robinson classically, when an interviewer asked him, "Did you catch the welterweight championship the other night? The welterweight title fight the other night, Mr. Robinson?" He said, "I'm awfully sorry to say I didn't. I'm just not a fight fan." And he said he certainly never enjoyed boxing. And a guy called Milton McCrory back in the 80s who beat Colin Jones, who's one of your compatriots, said, he said, I do boxing to make money. He said, as soon as the fight's over, I don't want to talk about it, read about it, or watch it. He said, baseball is what I love, and my sports hero is Alkaline. So, you know what? You raise a great point that not every boxer is into boxing. Martin Murray told me he hated it. He said, I don't like watching boxing. Somebody one time asked him, was he watching a certain fight? And he said, no, I'm watching Peppa Pig with the kids. So, they're not all into it.
Yeah. So we talked a bit about Tyson Fury, and we had a question basically sent in. It said, AJ versus Fury, discuss. Will it happen? When will it happen? Why won't it happen if it won't happen? And who wins and why?
Okay, I think it will happen now because I think the powers that be on both sides want to see it happen. The reasons why it wouldn't happen are the same reasons why any big fight doesn't happen in this era and hasn't happened or why Mayweather and Pacquiao took so long to get it on because too many vested interests want to keep these guys apart because they can make money without having to ruin each other's situation and career trajectory. That's one reason. Yeah. But I think, and also think, one of the positive flip sides of this coronavirus pandemic, Simon, could be that when we do get a chance to, so a bit like don't know what you got till it's gone, and you blow away all the small stuff, and you only focus on what matters. Like some people will be doing now with their family life and realizing what really matters to them, and thinking, does it even matter if I lose my house as long as my family don't, as long as my family are okay and still survive, So, and I think we'll notice that in boxing, that I think maybe there will be an eagerness to put that fight together, only the best and biggest fights. This is my theory, at least. I may be wrong. And I think that we may see a rush, scrap what we said, scrap the mandatory with Pulev that was obviously slated for, June the 20th at Tottenham Hotspur Ground. Never mind the pointlessness of a Fury Wilder 3, which there isn't a lot of expectation about anyway because of the conclusive nature of Fury's victory in the rematch. I think it will happen as soon as we're able to put on big events again. A little offshoot from that is you might have heard that there's been discussion of putting on big fights behind closed doors without a live crowd if they have to do it that way. I'm not sure you could put on one as big as Fury Joshua, but I think it will happen, Simon. And I think Corona might end up making it happen sooner rather than later and blowing out some of the obstacles conceivably in the way of it. And I like Anthony Joshua, and he's a lovely guy and he's a good fighter. I was very impressed with his performance, in the rematch against Ruiz, but I think Fury wins the fight. I've always thought Fury beats Joshua, even before Fury showed that kind of other string to his bow last time out. I just think he's the better, more robust, more talented, and I think he's the mentally stronger guy of the two as well.
Yeah, I think for me personally, like I've never been a massive Anthony Joshua fan. Like he's clearly very talented. You don't fight in the Olympics if you're not a good boxer, and I think that gets people sometimes. I see a lot of people say on like social media or Tyson Fury is just the better technical boxer, and I just think I think sometimes people get lost in the fact that Anthony Joshua has won so many fights by KO that they forget that he fought at the Olympics and he is a technically very good boxer. But I agree with you. I think Tyson Fury is a lot stronger mentally. AJ has shown signs in the Klitschko fight. There was a point where he looked, broken, but then, he did go on and come back from that and win the fight. So I mean, I say that on one hand, I think Tyson Fury is stronger, but mentally, but then equally, AJ did show a bit of mental toughness to have that kind of, he had Klitschko looked like he was going to finish him at one point, and he came back from that. So you got it, and obviously, I think it took a lot for AJ as well to against Ruiz to that second fight. He really had to turn up mentally more than physically and technically, because I think people knew that he could beat him from a fight point of view, but I think it was whether that loss and the aura disappearing of his undefeated streak, whether he could mentally get past that, and I think that was more impressive to me than his physical performance. But yes, I agree. I think Tyson Fury will. I think it'll be a good fight. I think it'll be closer than people think as well.
Yeah, just quickly, I think that what I didn't know about Anthony Joshua before, because he passed the gut check against Klitschko, as you said. I think that the distress signs were against Ruiz that gave people serious pause about his almost the sense of surrender in that fight. But what I didn't know about Joshua was that he was capable of boxing the way he did against Ruiz, getting on his toes for 12 rounds the way he did, and showing a bit of his best, kind of Ali karaoke style kind of effort, really. So, like you say, it's not a foregone conclusion, but I do fancy Fury for it.
Yes, me too. Okay, let's get into some of these questions. Let's go to the start. Okay, your nickname is White Sugar. Why?
Yeah. Because I liked Ali and Sugar Ray Leonard. I worshipped Ali and Sugar Ray Leonard when I was a kid. I tried to imitate that style. I started, young at 10, and I seemed to take to it. People thought I had a bit of flair. People made a bit of a fuss of me because I was the youngest in the club, and I showed a bit of spark of talent. I won my first 3 fights on the spin, which, although it's hardly Lomachenko's kind of amateur run, but it was still a bit of a thing that a lot of kids were losing their first bout at our club. We're just a small club in the sticks in Stroud called Roxburgh House ABC. And so I was a big fish in a small pond, I suppose you'd say. I mean, I had that kind of... I couldn't watch YouTube, but I could watch any alley fights I could find that ever used to be on BBC. I could watch Sugar Ray Leonard as his fights were transpiring in real time, unfolding. I kind of copied it from a young age and fancied myself as that kind of guy, you know, slick fighter. Thought I was black, I guess. And yeah, so by the time I was 15, I think I came up with the name White Sugar. And I went to Charlie Magri, former WBC flyweight champion of the world, who's still a friend of mine today. He had a shop on Bethnal Green Road, title sports shop, mostly specialising in boxing equipment in the old East End. And we went to get these shorts personalised. They were black and red satin, and we said we wanted white sugar on it. And Magri did a bit of a double take and said, "White sugar." It was my dad who actually went to get them done. And my dad said, "Why, do you think it's a bit over the top for an amateur, for a junior?" And obviously thinking he was getting paid by the letter. So he said, no, I think it's all right. So he put white sugar on the waistband of them shorts. And yeah, that was what I called myself. And to be honest with you, it kind of caught on about 30 years too late. But I am kind of glad, obviously you found that out from somewhere. People still do call me that, you know. Some people hate me for it as well and be like, he's a fraud. He makes out he was a fake amateur standout. I'm not convinced he even had the 38 amateur fights he said he had. We know he had some because of some footage on the internet, but they don't sag off the style. I'll be honest with that. I've never heard anybody say I can't fight, but they'll say, oh, he exaggerates and he's a fake amateur standout and he never turned pro, calls himself White Sugar, never had a fucking pro fight in his life. They're already detractors as well, but I'm proud of my little amateur career, such as it was. I'm glad I got a bit of footage when I came back after the 12 years in the wilderness, as it were. I was glad for the mere fact that I got some film footage of my fights, you know, so at least people can see kind of what I was like and make their own, you know, make their own judgment on it. Yeah, so that was White Sugar. It was about being, I don't know, I'd never heard of another white fighter called Sugar at the time. I'm still not sure if there's been one. I mean, I know Bradley Sugar Sweet Price, who's from the Valleys. He's mixed race, isn't he? I'm not sure if there's been another. There's never. You know what? I am surprised no flashy young likely lad of this era has come up as a pro, has come up with that name White Sugar, because you've got Brown Sugar, who's Ishan Pickering, who's a friend of mine, who, you know, fought out the Ingle gym. You've got you had Anthony Ogogo, who called himself Brutal for Brown Sugar. You've had a bunch of other Sugars like Sugar Shane Mosley. I'm surprised nobody has usurped me with a White Sugar tag, but nobody has.
Yeah. If you could have picked one opponent from any era, but it would be in your only fight ever, but you could have picked any opponent from any era, who would it have been?
Let me think about that. That's
allowed
interesting.
to fight once.
Yeah, just so hopefully you're crowning glory. Presumably, the protagonist is planning on winning, presumably, and then wants an opponent, a defining opponent. I'm not going to say one of my idols like Sugar Ray Leonard, because I think he'd beat me, and that is just that. And the honour of sharing the room with him. I would hate to fight Thomas Hearns, by the way. Who can I say without seeming too egotistical? I once saw Chris Eubank box. I've seen him a lot of fight, obviously, and I've interviewed him a bunch of times. But I remember watching Chris Eubank versus Gary Stretch. Gary was more of a light middleweight. He was a guy, you know, quite a slick white fighter who had some of the kind of nice smooth moves. And I remember thinking he had a half a chance against Chris at the time. When it came down to it, Eubank was basically too strong for him. But for a couple of rounds, Gary was doing okay. And I remember thinking, I was getting the itch, almost thinking already, I should be doing this again. I should be back in the gym. And I was, you know, encouraging him in the living room. My dad was supporting Eubank. I was supporting Stretch. And I remember thinking, in my reveries, I was thinking, I know how to go about boxing Eubank. You know, he can't handle movers. Dan Sherry, who's a good guy, who was on Facebook, mugged Chris Eubank off for 10 rounds until they had that controversy of the headbutt and then the technical decision and all the rest of it. So I'm going to say Chris Eubank, because when I was like 21, I'd imagine myself giving him the runaround, boxing him and staying out of trouble. So I'm going to say Eubank, all right?
Shout. Chris Eubank, incidentally, is one of my idols, mainly because the reason I ever started watching boxing was because I sat down and watched Chris Eubank versus Nigel Benn with my father. And if I hadn't have done that, I wouldn't have I dare say I would have as I had got older, but as a kid, I don't think I'd have ever had an interest in boxing. So I've always been very, I always be very interested in everything Chris Eubank does. And then in turn, when Chris Eubank Jr. come on the scene, I've been very interested in him as a follow-on to that. And funny enough, Chris Eubank's one of the few people who, I can't stand reality TV. I cannot stand it. I can't even watch a second of it, no matter what it is. But there's very few people who I'll follow enough that I'll watch them on other things, like outside of their chosen field. And he is one of them. I watched I'm a Celebrity, I think it was, with him. Him and Bez were the only two who I've kind of followed from outside of their fields, which was interesting. Who is the most underrated boxer from the UK in the last 15 to 20 years?
Most underrated. You know what? It's probably Duke McKenzie, although he's not from the last 15 or 20. He's a little longer ago. I will try and update it with that time scale if you wish. I think Duke, because Duke won world titles at 3 weights, he is a little bit undervalued for that. I realise world titles are more, prolific even in his era than they were a good 20 years before that. But I think Duke is hardly ever mentioned, although he was mentioned in an article in The Sun today about the 10 best British boxers of the last 30 years. Other underrated guys who haven't got their props in the last 20 years, it's only the 2000s, isn't it? We're only talking about the 2000s. It's interesting. Let's go from heavyweights just to get a feel for the fighters in that kind of era. It basically of the 21st century, essentially, most underrated British fighter. I think Junior Witter, he might not be the answer, but I think he's probably a little bit undervalued. I think he would have. I happen to think he might have beaten Ricky Hatton when there was a clamour for that fight, even though Hatton went on to achieve more. I think Junior Witter, he was slated for his fight with Zab Judah, and I actually thought he did very well at short notice, considering how relatively green he was. So Witter would be one of those guys. Trying to think of a few more before we move on.
Where you are then, there's a kind of second part of the question is the same question for outside of the UK as well. So to open
the most underrated fighter of the 21st, most underrated fighter of the 21st century from outside of the UK. What would that be?
So many to choose from, and it's tough to
It is, yeah. I mean, I could think of it earlier if it went back like 30 or 40 years, but of this century, it almost takes a while to marinate for those legacies even. But to give you a quick answer, who would it have been? Probably Roman Gonzalez, I would say, even though he's rated enough in boxing circles and people who know what they're talking about. But there is an argument that Roman Gonzalez was the greatest fighter of this century so far. You know, that he has a rival body of work to Floyd Mayweather. He was undefeated for a very long time. He was a 3-weight world champion. It's the usual story. If he'd have been bigger, if he'd have spoke English, he would have been a superstar outside of his, native Mexico. But Roman Gonzalez was one hell of a fighter, and he probably is the most because even a guy like Naoya Inoue is getting his props now, and he's broken out of that kind of cult status he was in. Now he's more mainstream. I'm going to say Roman Gonzalez. That is easier for me to say than the British question, to be honest with you.
Okay, cool. What else we got? Was boxing always the only sport for you, or were you interested in other sports growing up?
No, to be honest, I never really was. I mean, I had a passing interest in tennis. I thought that McEnroe was kind of cool when I was a kid. The controversy, and obviously he was a very good player. I played a bit of tennis, and I got good enough to be able to serve properly. Most people do the cheat serve, don't they, just to get a game going? Especially when Wimbledon's on, you get that clamour to use the court. Suddenly, I could serve overhead and play a game, but I never competed in that sphere. It was really always about boxing to me. It was. Okay. I almost consider boxing really distinct from the other sports. Like it's a kind of tragic theatre, and it's it's a seedy underworld, and it's a glamorous yet corrupt entertainment industry. It seems to have a more fascinating folklore than any other sport. I mean, I might be biased, but I would stake that claim. It has a more fascinating backstory, and more fascinating characters than any other sport can match it for the rich tapestry. So it was always about boxing for me.
Okay, cool. Do you follow MMA at all?
I must admit, I don't. I know really entry level stuff. A couple of big names. Obviously, I'm aware of the McGregor phenomenon. I've trained a few MMA fighters, but only in boxing. You know, when they need a guy for striking. Obviously, in the last several years, boxers and MMA fighters have shared gyms. Sometimes they've come into contact, so there's been a certain amount of cross pollination. And I've taken on a couple of. I think I did pads one time with Paul Daly, who's a famous MMA fighter. I held the pads for him just one time. I had an MMA fighter called Wendell Lewis at one point who used me as his striking coach. They call it, don't they?
Yes.
So, but no, I don't know much about it, and it's not something I'm into as a fan.
Okay. What about bare-knuckle boxing? What's your opinion of it, and what did you make of Paulie Malignaggi versus Artem Lobov? If you watched it,
I think the BKB. I'm really surprised that became as big as it's become, because I would have thought you might have thought it was something that, aside from the pioneering era, starting with James Figg in 1719 and going through, up until John L. Sullivan bridged the gloved bare knuckle gap. You might have thought it was something that was relegated to gypsy quarrels and illegal covert fights in fields. But the fact that it's been, it just shows you in this era you can market almost anything if you do it right. And I think that's what they've done. Like the MMA explosion, I think they probably looked at that as well. Thought some people are bored with boxing the way the format has got. Maybe it's a bit staid for them, particularly since the best don't fight the best as routinely as they used to. It's certainly not in the 70s and the 80s. So I think maybe for the more kind of what's the quick fix, the instant gratification angle, the people who want to see shorter fights, more violent fights, more blood, more like they do in MMA as well. I've been to one BKB show and it was okay. I think what's interesting about it is the fight can really turn on a spin of a coin. You can get two well-matched boxers who are not going to hurt each other in a million years sometimes because they've got the measure of each other. Perhaps neither of them is a big puncher. They're both very defensively adept. They cancel each other out, whatever. And you can see 12 rounds, which perhaps not very scintillating to people, all but the purists, let's say.
Yeah.
With the bare-knuckle boxing, I could see somebody lands a decent shot with them tiny gloves. Well, they've not really got gloves. They've got
wraps, isn't it?
Yeah, they've got wraps, and the knuckles are still, the hands are protected, but the knuckles are still bare, as I understand it. So someone takes one of those punches, next thing you know, he's got an eye out here when he just made one mistake. So I found the fights could turn on a spin of a coin, and you could see a stoppage, not really a knockout so much, but you could see a stoppage very quickly from out of nowhere. And I guess that was exciting for a lot of people. It's pacey, and so yeah, I mean, I didn't see the Malignaggi fight. I saw Paulie's hands after it. I can see for Paulie it was a challenge, wasn't it? He was retired as a boxer. One thing I'm aware of is boxers who basically haven't got it anymore in the ring, they can't compete at the elite level or whatever level they used to be at in boxing, tend to turn to BKB. So one might assume the entry level is not as high as it is for boxing, based on that logic. But I can see why Paulie wanted another challenge, and it's all another payday, isn't it?
Yeah, I believe it's not something that I followed massively closely myself. I followed a little bit of it. I believe that they had the people who invested in it, or the people who own it, they've got a bit of money behind them. So I think, they were looking for the kind of bigger names like a Paulie Malignaggi to put on a fight where they could. They were paying them well, shall we say? Which quite rightly, I believe that. Boxers and MMA fighters should be among the best paid athletes in the world because they're putting their health and future health in other people's hands, and we've seen over the years things that can go wrong during these fights. So I believe they should be well paid. I'd much rather see fighters getting the money which footballers get than the other way around, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But I
Okay.
guess it's supply and demand, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, that's it. It's absolutely. Who is the most nervous fighter you've ever seen?
Most nervous fighter I've ever seen. I know I've never been with Danny Williams before fights, but I know Danny Williams well, and I know people who trained him like Dave Pereira and Spencer Fearon. And I've been in dressing room situations with Danny Williams when he was helping me with a fighter who had a fight in the south of France one time. And I know Danny used to get terrible nerves, which could defeat him sometimes before he went in. He could have a bad day at the office. He was brilliant on his day, Danny, and always brilliant in the gym, but sometimes erratic in the ring. And some people said that was down to nerves and his temperament in general. That would be one. I saw a kid. There was a kid once who shouldn't have turned pro. He was from Bristol, and he came up to me for a few training sessions and said that he wanted to turn pro. He was going to be a journeyman. He knew the score. Steve Goodwin signed him. He hadn't had a lot of amateur fights, and the guy basically, it wasn't the right time for him to turn pro. He seemed there's nerves. His kind of gallows humour. We kept talking about, he'd be on about, we'll get a picture later. If I'm not in A&E, he kept laughing nervously. But he made too many jokes like that in a way that I'd never experienced before. And I think he fought a guy called Paul Upton, who was one of the Upton brothers, who was an up and coming kid, and he got stopped in the first round. And when he fought again for his second pro fight, he got stopped in the first again. And to the best of my knowledge, he hasn't boxed as a pro since then. That was a few years ago. He was one of the more nervous ones I've seen. So as a famous case, Danny Williams, and as a non-famous case, this kid who shall remain nameless because he's a nice guy and doesn't deserve to be named, but he seemed very nervous to me.
So the kind of follow-up to that question was also, is there a fighter which stands out in memory who you've seen that couldn't handle the nerves before the big fights, where it kind of, caused them an issue, shall we say, going into the fight? But obviously you just mentioned the guy there.
Yeah, well, do you know what? I think Trevor Berbick bottled it to an extent against Mike Tyson, because if you look at Berbick, he was kind of kamikaze aggressive against Mike Tyson in a way that if you start trading up with a big puncher that early, I think it's a sign you've lost your nerve, because anybody can run at the guy. It doesn't take any presence of mind or self-possession to do that. That's just saying, well, fuck it. I'm going to mill at the guy, and if I get KO'd, I get KO'd. I think when somebody starts trading like crazy, suicidally with a big puncher, I think it's a sure sign. It's not a brave move at all. I think it's a covert sign that the nerve has gone. So I think Trevor Berbick cracked against Mike Tyson.
Okay.
And that's why he got KO'd so early, one of the reasons.
Okay, now we're going to get into some of the more random ones. Who's the biggest tosser that you've met within boxing?
Let me say, who's going to get... I'm not a big fan of Carl Frampton, although when I say met him, I mean, I've been around him. He's been in the gym and come to spar at the old TKO and all the rest of it. To give you the backstory, I did an interview with Joe Joyce. I've done a few, but I'm not allowed to do any more, apparently. I've been told never to ask for another interview with Joe Joyce again by his manager, Sam Jones. And what it was, a friend of mine, I was just interviewing on the phone because I gave Boxing Social the camera back once I stopped working for them. I don't have a camera, so unless I bring someone with me who's a proper camera person, I'm good to go on the phone. I know my way around editing. You can get quite good results on a phone. I realise it doesn't look as good, but so I'm interviewing Joe Joyce on the phone, and a friend of mine who's a photographer who's come to the press conference, which was a Billy Joe Saunders press conference ahead of his appearance at the Stevenage football ground. So there's a picture my friend's taken of me filming Joe Joyce on the phone, and it was kind of a cool picture. So because Joe Joyce has a reputation as being a bit dry and a bit not classically charismatic and being quite a tough interview, rightly or wrongly, I posted on my Facebook and I think Instagram as well. The picture, there's me filming him, and the caption is, "It's okay, Joe. I've got an app on here that makes the interviews more controversial and interesting post production," or something like that. Yeah. Making the point that Joe Joyce is not the most talkative fella. And somebody grabbed hold of that, said, so-called boxing journalist Ben Doughty takes the piss out of Joe Joyce, even though he was nice enough to give an interview to some wanker with an iPhone. Now, for some reason, Frampton jumped on this and screenshotted that and tweeted it, saying, "Prick, I hope Joe recognises him next time." And and then it went viral, and people were hanging me out to dry, like we spoke about the toxic Twitter thing. The pitchfork mob were out for me, and to be honest, I can't be bothered to argue with tossers with false names. I mean, with Frampton, I could have gone back at him, but to be honest, I figured I'll wait till I see Frampton. And I have seen him since at presser, and I just elected not to speak to him. In my mind, I was going to say, if you want to call me a wanker, I'll give you opportunity to do it to my face. But then I thought, you know what, that's not going to prove a whole lot either. I was with my girlfriend at one of the occasions because I saw him twice I think within the same couple of days. I think it was when was it Campbell Lomachenko press conference or whatever it was anyway. And she said, "Oh, just forget about it," But so I'm not a big fan of Carl Frampton because I don't understand why he needed to create that situation. But you know what, it is what it is. I suppose Frampton would say he's been at the sharp end of that and he thinks I'm being disrespectful. If Carl Frampton knew me, he'd know that I'm not. I would never disrespect the fighter. I like Joe Joyce; he's a nice guy, and I didn't mean anything bad by it. And I thought of all the things that go on in the world, and all the much more uglier, more controversial tweets they are, I thought they were really scraping the bottom of the barrel with that one. Riddick Bowe, not overly friendly either. Riddick Bowe spoke to him in Vegas very briefly, asked him perhaps for a picture. It wasn't the be all and end all. He's not an idol of mine, but I thought it would be something for social media.
Yeah.
First guy that we met that day as we went to the weigh-in for Floyd Mayweather Madonna 2. And he was like, "No, how much money you got?" And he was just a bit, people have said Bowe is a bit like that. So Riddick Bowe and Carl Frampton, listen, I'm sure if I knew Carl Frampton on a different basis and Riddick Bowe, I'm sure I'd probably like them and they like me. But that my impression of both of them, not great.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think like even just from what you told me about the tweet which you put up about Joe Joyce, it's kind of clear that it's like tongue in cheek, in it. But
do you know what? I thought it was kind of mild.
People get.
I've got an app, Joe. I've got the app that makes the interviews more interesting and controversial. I said it's pretty mild, isn't it? I mean, I could have even retreated from that at all and said, I don't know what you're talking about. But like I say, my Twitter went mad for a week or so with that. People saying, "Oh, I've created situations around myself before that people can jump on." I mean, I was involved in something in 2016, a scandal about some ticket money for Brooke Golovkin fight. If you Google that, you'll see it, and you'll see people saying I was a con man and a thief and all the rest of it. And end of the day, that's another story. We could get into it at some point in the future. I suggest not this time because we've been talking a little while about different things. But it's something I'm perfectly prepared to talk about another occasion. But some people will say, "Oh, that's that wanker who stole all the ticket money." You know what I mean? So that's another story for another day, Simon.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll have you back on and we can talk about all sorts. Right, I'll try and get through some of these questions now because I just don't want to. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, more than anything. But as I'm enjoying it, so I'm happy. Okay, what we got? Johnny Wish says, "Are you familiar with Gavin Rees?"
Of course. I mean, I know him on Facebook. Gavin won everything, didn't he? British, European, WBA World Light Welterweight title. He won the prize fighter as well, just to add to the trophy cabinet. I mean, Gavin had a fantastic career, really, and he seems like a nice fella.
Yeah, he said, if so, what are your opinions of him as a boxer and as a trainer now?
As a trainer, I don't really know, but as a boxer, like I say, Gavin won the lot. I know he had a few dedication issues, I think he would admit earlier before he got hold of himself. I think he got into trouble a little bit, probably having a beer, all the rest of it, and getting into the odd fight, not knocking somebody out who perhaps he thought deserved it. So I do remember him having a hiatus to his career because of stuff that was going on outside the ring. But once he got hold of himself, Gavin had a great engine. Was a very good boxer. Pretty versatile guy. He knew his way around the ring. More of a pressure fighter, an aggressive fighter. And to win the WBA title the way he did, he didn't have a long reign or anything like that. But it's a fantastic career that he had. When he could have been someone that they'd written off at a certain point. I'm sure he's a good, conscientious trainer. I don't judge trainers generally unless I've seen them in the gym or had a chance to observe what they're about, because you can be surprised. Some guys got a good reputation, and I don't always learn a lot from them. Other guys you never hear of, I think, have got great boxing intellect and got some great methods, and they just haven't had the lucky break, perhaps. So, I think Gavin, no doubt, if he got the same mindset and dedication he had as a fighter, there's no reason why he couldn't excel as a trainer. But I guess that's a work in progress.
Yeah, So Danny Batten, who does the fight shows with me, obviously it was a former Cage Warriors champion. He speaks a lot about fight IQ being vital in terms of, in some ways, more important than like technical training and drills and things like that, and kind of being able to adapt in the situation if your game plan's not working or and things like that. And I think if you've got trainers in your team or your camp who have got that about them, where they think a bit outside the box, or they think, they've got a good mind for boxing or MMA, if it's MMA, where they can come up with different game plans. They can change the game plan mid-fight. I think sometimes I watch like boxing or MMA, and I see fighters' game plans not working during a fight, and they don't seem to have the ability to change it up. And to me, that should come from the coaches or the training staff, whatever you want to call them. But I don't know what you feel about like fight IQ as a quality coach.
I think it's a massive asset for a coach and obviously for a boxer, because sometimes a boxer does need it naturally, and it needs to. Great fighters do tend to make their own adjustments to an extent, although obviously a coach with that chemistry and an equivalent IQ is a major factor as well. But I think, they have to be able to read a fight. What I've noticed is sometimes guys are okay at the top level with a good fighter who's winning, but when he gets in a crisis, they don't know what to do, because when the opponent hasn't read the script, maybe. I remember thinking Nonito Donair's trainers didn't have a clue what to tell him against Guillermo Rigondeaux in 2013. He was the emergent superstar of the sport who was winning, who was knocking out everybody, Nonito Donair. He suddenly is getting his head boxed off by a Cuban genius, and they didn't really know what to tell him. And at this point, you realise how redundant they were, and they were just basically people to give you water and Vaseline. Perhaps I'm being a bit disparaging with that, but I do remember thinking they don't know what to tell him now this problem has arrived, And I think you do need to. You can't always guarantee the fighter's going to know, is going to be able to act upon your advice and your adjustments, but you should at least know how to advise him of them, But you've got to know the fighter too, because there are certain fighters who can only do certain things. So you can't tell them to do one thing when you know they can't do it. Sometimes you've got to go with what their best bet is. I think you have to be a great trainer, and I've certainly. I don't think I'll ever be one, because I don't think I have that real mindset or the dedication for it. I think I like the journalism too much. But to be a great trainer, I think you have to have that kind of multifaceted boxing IQ and ability, not just to see the game plan and what is required, but to know whether your fighter can do it or not. Never mind how to play the psychology games with him.
Indeed. So, in your opinion and to the best of your knowledge, JD wants to know who you think is the best out-and-out boxing coach in the world at the moment. He says not necessarily a trainer, but an actual out-and-out coach.
It's very difficult, Simon, because I think there's a lot of mystique around the trainer's arts, and I think I always remember Angelo Dundee saying, "I'm only as good as the guy in the stall." I also remember Freddie Roach saying, "I didn't make 22 world champions," when that was his total, which was a while ago. He said, 22 world champions made me. That is a major factor. At the end of the day, the fighter's the one who's got to go and do it. We should never forget that. But the best trainer in the world right now, I think Freddie Roach, I just mentioned, is a great trainer who's got a proven CV. I think Jimmy Tibbs, as far as Britain concerns, I still think he's our greatest coach with the greatest body of work. If I was boxing, I would probably want Jimmy with me. Still, from a British angle, I think Freddie Roach probably takes some beating, because some of his kind of contemporaries have passed away in the last several years, like Emmanuel Stewart. Who else is really good today? I think Ben Davison is a good coach. He's obviously a young coach coming up, but I think he's got a fantastic boxing IQ, and I think he will continue to excel and distinguish himself. Nacho Beristan in the States is a good coach. Vasyl Lomachenko's dad is good at training Vasyl Lomachenko, and he's probably a very good coach. I'm trying to think who else is. I'll come up with Beristan, Roach, Jimmy Tibbs is retired now, by the way. He just does a bit of cut work with the likes of Shane McGuigan. But Jimmy Tibbs, when he was still active, was the Britain's greatest coach.
Cool. And is there a coach which kind of springs to mind who can think outside the box, maybe not do the kind of usual training drills or usual tactics, someone who just completely thinks differently to everyone else? Is there someone who springs to mind?
I think it was Brendan Ingle when he was alive, when he was active. That fantastic legacy created at Sheffield, which kind of started with Harold Bomber Graham and culminated with Prince Nassim Hamed. The Ingles, if you ever get known for having your own style, your own blueprint, your own brand in boxing, people to this day still study the Ingles style, or they say, I think he'd be good with the Ingles because he's loose-limbed and unorthodox and he's a switch hitter. I think he'd suit the Ingle methods, the Ingle style. So Brendan was absolutely an outside-the-box guy, I think Howard Rainey, an old trainer who not everybody would have heard of, but he trained Colin McMillan, most famously, Sweet to See. He was a bit of a boffin and an inventor who wasn't afraid to think outside the box. We know Custamato had his own blueprint, which was quite distinctive, which we saw with Jose Torres, Floyd Patterson and Mike Tyson. Today, a kind of more outside-the-box coach. You know what? Some of these conditioners, like Mackie Charlestone, who was the guy who helped Michael Spinks put on 25 pounds of muscle to fight Larry Holmes in 1985. But even in later years, he worked with Roy Jones to bulk him up to heavyweight to beat John Ruiz. And he worked with Bernard Hopkins to bulk him up to light heavyweight when he beat Antonio Tava. He seems a very interesting guy. When he had a different take, some of those new methods he brought in, using sprints. We thought in the 80s when Michael Spinks went from 175 pounds to 200 pounds, we thought with our ignorance then that it must mean he would be slow and sluggish and maybe putting on a bit of fat. And he said, no, Michael's body fat is lower now than it was when he was a light heavyweight. As a 15-year-old, that blew my mind, to be honest with you, because I had never heard that before. And they said he was doing a lot of sprints. Why train for a marathon when you need 15 3-minute bursts because there were 15 rounders still those days? So a guy like Mackie Charlestone is a conditioning guru I'm very interested in. Kerry Kayes in later years with Ricky Hatton seemed to be not necessarily outside the box in terms of his own industry, but brought ideas outside the box from boxing. Yeah. Ricky Hatton did a lot of weight training, drank a hell of a lot of fluid, and none of that old school rubbish about don't drink water like Chris Eubank would go without a drink for like a week and all that rubbish. So I'd say Kerry Kayes, guys like that. What's the guy? Alex Ariza was another guy who's a controversial figure, of course, because of the rumours of Peds and Manny Pacquiao and all that. But on the conditioning side, I'd say Alex Ariza and Kerry Kayes in recent years. In the boxing side, I can't think of many mavericks around on the boxing side today, I must admit. But guys like Brendan Ingle certainly were.
Cool, I like
Not
it.
Guys like him, just Brendan on his own.
Yeah, I like it. Okay, so there was that one which you sent me earlier, which was someone said they'd like to know at what point in your life boxing transformed from a hobby to an obsession.
Just overnight, basically. But I was certainly after the first training session anyway, Simon. I mean, I was into it as a kid. I watched Muhammad Ali. That was my hero when I was a little boy. I had boxing gloves at the time, 4-ounce gloves. I used to spar with my dad, who'd get on his knees and spar. I've heard a few people tell a similar story. I guess dads generally, unless they are midgets, tend to have to do that if they want to spar with their infant sons, so I guess I'm not the only one. But as soon as I started boxing officially on January the 8th, 1980 at the inaugural night opening of Roxburgh House ABC Youth Club, Stroud. It was a new ABA club. They made a bit of a fuss of the launch of a new ABA club. They brought lots of officials down. They brought famous, notable boxers from the region. Most famous and well-known was Peter Hanlon, who went on to captain the 1980 Olympic team as a featherweight, was an ABA champion, a Commonwealth Games silver medal winner. I got to spar with Pete Hanlon that night for the cameras for the local papers, and there was a picture of me in the Gloucester Citizen and the Strand News and Journal landing a left jab to Hanlon's stomach. And with the little bit of notoriety, that was my first experience of coverage. I was hooked, to be honest with you. And from then on, I started reading books from the library, books that I was bought for by parents and stuff, relatives. Yeah. And I became, by the time I was 11, I was a kind of unassailable historian who, people had started talking like Joe Lewis and Jack Johnson, and I would pull rank. And eventually, before very long, they were saying, don't argue with him. because he'll end up being right. It was harder then. We didn't have Google. The annoying thing really then was you couldn't prove people are wrong unless you carried all these books with you.
Yeah,
like you couldn't just tell them they were talking rubbish because you had to go home and get the book and bring it back. But I was obsessed from the age of 10 onwards. As soon as I went in that gym, really.
I gotta say, like, it's incredible your boxing like knowledge, but also like your ability to it's like an encyclopedia of boxing. Yeah, just to access it. Incredible memory. So Alan Jones of Away Day Apparel asks. He said he'd like to hear you discuss the career of Joe Calzaghe. He keeps saying that he came into the weight division of choice. You can only fight, because I've been saying a lot recently where we've covered the Joe Calzaghe fights to Alan as well. I've been saying you can only fight what's in front of you. So like that when he fought Roy Jones Jr., that was the Roy Jones Jr. that was in front of him. Same with Hopkins. Now, obviously, it could have been a different story if they had met earlier in their careers, but at that point, Joe had to fight them as they were. And Alan says, would Joe have beaten, Eubank, Ben, Collins, Watson in their primes? He said Joe Calzaghe called Roy Jones out for years, but wouldn't step up to fight him at light heavyweight when Jones was the champion. He also talks. Joe talks about his fight with Jeff Lacey as his best performance, but Alan thinks that it was his fight versus Kessler, which was the turning point and when he became the new prospect. And he says, discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with him about Kessler because I think Kessler was a better fighter than Lacey. Lacey was very hyped up, had a big reputation. They were calling him they were likening him to a kind of Mike Tyson type figure. I think he was a little overrated but it was still you give Joe major props for doing what he did to him. It was a beautiful performance. It was just so aesthetically, it was so fantastic. The skills and the exhibitionism and the sheer glee. That was Joe's coming out party when he suddenly said, "This is what I can do, baby," and the whole world's going to take notice of the sheer manner of my mastery in that ring. Joe was doing something I've never seen anybody do actually. When the guy is an orthodox, he's a left hooker, right? So Lacey's trying the left hook, and Joe being a southpaw, so the left hook's near to Joe's lead hand. He was rolling underneath that left hook and hitting him with an uppercut on the chin. I could demonstrate this if I wasn't holding this selfie stick to keep the camera here. But it was just amazing stuff that Joe was doing in there. And but no, Kessler was a better, more solid fighter. And I do think that's the better win. The Hopkins win, I think, is a great win still because look what Hopkins achieved afterwards. You can't say Hopkins was washed up just because he was old, because Hopkins is an anomaly and a freak of nature. I'm not even going to say Hopkins was past his prime. You know what? Because I don't necessarily believe Hopkins was any more. I don't think he was in his prime when Bernard fought Roy Jones. I think he was too green and too young. So major props for it was an ugly fight with Hopkins and it was a close fight, but I do think Joe won it. I think he nicked it quite simply. The Roy Jones fight was kind of meaningless, but I guess it was closure for Joe. It was a bit of a sad spectacle from a Jones point of view. I think Joe's quite honest and says that he might not have beaten Roy Jones when he was really at his zenith. But you know what? You can't write Joe off because he's a supreme competitor. He never lost. He did have elite historical skills. I think he'd have been a problem for anybody in any era. Joe would have once had to choose between middleweight and light heavy. There would have been no mid ground in another era. John Conte's era, let's say, Freddie Mills' era. So it would have been harder for Joe if he'd have come around in another era when things were a bit less kind of streamlined with the WBO universe, the IBF universe. I know Joe did eventually clear up and collect all those belts, but he deserves his place in the Hall of Fame. He is one of the greatest British fighters we've had, and I do think he has an argument to being the greatest super middleweight of all time. At least he has that argument. So, I suspect he probably wouldn't have beaten Roy Jones had they fought in, let's say, 2000. But I do, getting back to the first part of the question, I think he'd have always beaten Eubank and Ben and Collins because I think he was a better fighter than they were, and I think he would have adapted, like you spoke about, that ability. Certain great fighters we spoke about have the ability to do that. Yeah. I think Joe, I would have backed him against Eubank, Ben and Collins. Yeah, I would. Anytime.
One of the things when we watched the Roy Jones Jr. fight back, which really struck me, was I had forgotten how one-sided it was. Like the judges on the scorecard gave the first 2 rounds to Roy Jones, but I think Calzaghe comfortably won every single round. And I was trying to think if I could remember another fight where it had gone 12 rounds and one fighter had won every round, and I couldn't really remember one. Can you think of a fight where that's happened? Where it's gone the full distance, but...
Yeah, I could think of a few. We call it a shutout. In American boxing terms, they call it shutout, right?
Okay.
I think Billy Joe Saunders against David Lemieux, for a more recent example, I think Billy Joe might have won every round of that fight. I think Floyd Mayweather versus a few people. I think against Canelo, maybe I gave Canelo a share of the first round. After that, I think Floyd won every round, arguably. What else? Shutouts over the course of history. I think there is another one that springs to mind here somewhere. Perhaps it will come to me.
But I mean, just with that Joe Calzaghe fight, while you're racking your brains, I thought, Joe Calzaghe, I thought his performance was very good. You can only fight what's in front of you, like I said. But
did Joshua lose a round to Ruiz? Second time? Maybe not.
Check that. I don't know.
It was in that kind of ballpark of 120, 108, wasn't it? I mean, it was...
Yeah.
Like you say, I'd have to watch it again. You'd have to watch it again. But it was approaching that kind of shutout, I think.
Indeed. Okay, what else we got? Let's have a look. Neil Park asked on Facebook, he wouldn't hear you talk about the out-of-control nature of manufactured fighters. Sorry.
Or did he say fighters or belts?
Sorry, manufactured champions.
Yeah, exactly. Meaning the championship status. Yeah. I mean, Neil knows me reasonably well on social media, whatever, but I think it has gotten out of control inevitably. I think we've got to a point. Quoting Bob Arum again, he once said that eventually they will destroy themselves. He said, "I hope there's 10 world titles," and he said the reason why is because I think they will ruin their credibility the more they multiply and proliferate. So. I mean, initially, I remember we thought it was ridiculous, the advent of the IBF. We'd gotten used in the early 80s to the WBA and WBC. We were kind of okay with that, although some of the old school veterans said it was ridiculous having more than one world champion. Then we got the IBF, which seemed very spurious at the time, particularly when we saw the advent of the super middleweight division, which we thought was a division too many, whatnot. We got used to it. The IBF became legitimised. The WBO seemed like the poor relation for a while, but then they gained ground. With guys like Nigel Benn was the first WBO champion from Britain that I remember. Then you got a guy like Nassim Hamid who won the WBO belt and really helped to create this notion that it was a proper title. You got other guys like Barrera win it, and eventually you got to a point, certainly in the 21st century, when the WBO had as many quality title holders as the rest of them had. There's a traditional belief that the WBC is the best, but I think that's a load of nonsense. I think that's spurious now. I think you've got to judge on the merit of the fighters. But, so we ended up getting 4 world titles, 4 world champions at every weight, pretty much across the board, except in rare cases of, unifications, which were very hard to keep together once that had been. You might unify, but you try holding both those titles and satisfying both obligations. You can't do it. And they might want to unify for the economic value short term, but sooner or later they're going to want their titles back and divided because they don't want to share the sanctioning fees. So anyway, then you got the ludicrous nature then of getting the WBA started to break up their world titles at the same weight division. They started saying we've got a super champion, an interim champion, a champion emeritus, or a regular champion. So then you started getting this notion that you had more than 4 world champions at the same weight, and you may have up to 6 people. Do you know Trevor Bryan is technically the WBA regular heavyweight champion of the world, or he certainly was last time I could be bothered to look. Now, he would struggle to get arrested, if he set himself on fire outside of the White House. So it is ridiculous, it is ridiculous. And crazy, I think inevitably people win world. But do you know what the trade-off is? People win world titles. It's less of a big deal now. People line the streets in their thousands to greet Barry McGuigan when he came home, or Randolph Turpin in 1951 when he beat the great Sugar Ray Robinson. These days, it is a bit more of it is seen as less of an achievement. You've got guys like Ricky Burns who has won world titles at 3 weights. No disrespect to Ricky, but he would never. He couldn't possibly have achieved that. I don't think in a 30 years before now, or earlier. So I think it's out of control. But what are you supposed to do? Simon, there's an argument from other people, particularly insiders or fans who want to seem like they're clued up, when they say as long as fighters are making more money, I'm okay with it. But to me, that is so spurious, because what it's saying is, a fight is a fight and it should have an organic value. What you're saying is the audience is so bloody ignorant that they don't understand the difference. They don't know. So you can lie to them, essentially. That's what it's saying. I mean, I would have thought if boxing could just be popular as it can possibly be, if we market fights over fighters and personalities, perhaps, even though I'm not saying personalities aren't good and they're not important, like Tyson Fury, but if we would market the quality of the product more and show that's all people really care about is good, exciting fights, you can't have them every day. You can't have them every week. Barry Hearn said, listen, sometimes it's an ordinary day at work, sometimes it's a special day at work, but with special days come special payments. I get that, but I do think that most people, reasonably neutral, would agree that the proliferation of world titles in boxing has gotten a little bit beyond the joke, to the point where the fans certainly don't know who is the main man, and I think that's a shame, And I don't believe that fighters can't make money and good revenue without that. I think we could have a more integral sense of a world number one, and we could still have a commercial rewards across the board. I would like to think, anyway. Maybe some of these things are wrong.
Like, I'd argue that if you had one belt for each weight division, with maybe like an interim champion as well at certain points, that having one belt would make it all mean more.
Yeah, of course.
It would in turn increase the commercial value, because being the world champion would mean you are the world champion for your weight. So
absolutely,
there's that side to it as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. And what's to say we couldn't have big, high grossing non-title fights, but ultra meaningful fights? What it is, Simon, there's no such thing as a contender anymore. Okay, because everybody's a champion of some sort and has some kind of hardware, because that's how you market yourself these days, without the trinkets. And it happens in a white collar. White collar. There was a program the other night about white collar boxing that was kind of trying to cast it in a bad light. But they win their fake belts. So do the unlicensed kids. And some of them realise it's a bit of fun. Some of them are getting seriously guessed, and they think they're something they're not. So you're right. I mean, of course it would have more value if it wasn't so bogusly replicated all the time. There used to be honour and nobility in being a contender, and there used to be also revenue. You were at the top of the upper echelons, and you still had good earning capacity in a certain ballpark. So there are no contenders anymore, really, because almost everybody gets to call himself a world champion of some sort if they got to a world level.
Indeed. Okay. I've got a couple more questions, and then I'll leave you be. Let's have a look. Okay. Peaches wants to know, is David Haye as arrogant in real life as he seems on TV, as he seems like a massive prick?
Do you know what? Funny you should say that, Peaches. I've never warmed to David Haye. I've met most people in British boxing, certainly, and many of the people in world boxing on my travels for my sins as a kind of general social media interviewer, hustler. And I don't warm to David Haye. I've never actually spoke to him, and I've never asked him for a picture. I've got pictures with most people, the luminaries, the great and good, which I like to have for my little collection. Some of them are more treasured than others. I mean, the only ones actually up in my house where I am now is Sugar Ray Leonard, Mike Tyson, Marvin Hagler and Tommy Hearns. I do want to put more up, but I haven't got around to it. But anyway, Haye, I've never got a picture with Haye. I've never bothered interviewing him, although I've had the opportunity at press conferences. And I don't really warm to him. No, I can't fully tell you what it is, and I'm not saying I couldn't change my mind. But David Haye is one of the few fighters I don't feel very well disposed towards. I remember one time he took a picture with there's a friend of mine, a young lady who does a bit of white collar boxing, who's a close friend of mine, and she wanted a picture with him, and he seemed a bit disinterested, to the point where I was taking a picture, and at one point I said to him, "Look at the camera then," because he looked like he was almost looking the other way, and I don't get a good vibe off David Haye, but that doesn't mean I may have it wrong. I can't assassinate his character or write him off because I don't really know him, but I don't. Yeah, I feel that question anyway. Yeah.
So, like, basically, definitely, he hasn't necessarily done anything to kind of make you dislike him as such, but you haven't warmed to him either.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's rare because normally I would have made a beeline for him.
Okay. Okay, let's have a look. What's your views on Welsh boxer Cody Davis? Many in Wales believe he has the ability and the temperament to go all the way and be one of the top next big star in Wales.
Yeah, I mean, I know Gavin Rees trains him. He looks good. He's passed the test he's faced so far. I like the look of him. The couple of times I've seen him, I also get updated on his training because Gavin will post stuff like any conscientious boxing person these days. You know, updates their journey and what they're up to, and he always looks incredibly ripped, Cody. Like, it looks like he trains very hard. Yeah. He's always in fantastic condition, and he looks like a pretty decent, box fighter to me, Cody. I think you sure could have high hopes for him.
Robbie Regan also, how good was he?
You know what? He probably gets one of the more underrated Welsh champions. I mean, he was a 2-weight world champion, if memory serves. I met Robbie one time in 2016. We didn't. So it looks like you've disappeared here.
Where did he go? Ah, you're back. There you go. Go on, just go from Robbie Regan.
Yeah, look, you disappeared there. Robin, yeah, I met him in 2016, and we did an interview for Boxing Social when Boxing Social didn't have any interviews. Basically, I was the only person doing any. The brand was just launching, and they didn't use it for whatever reason. Maybe the sound quality, but we interviewed him in a hotel I interviewed him in a hotel in Kensington somewhere, and I think he was a good fighter, Robbie. Once again, if he was a bigger guy, he'd have been more of a star, no doubt. But he was. I mean, I guess he carried Welsh boxing for a little while in the early 90s. Also, the mid 90s,
Yeah.
So yeah, I think he should probably get more plaudits and props than he does. Robbie, good fighter.
Yeah, I had him on a show actually a couple of weeks back. He did an episode of My Story with him, and the sound was it wasn't great in that, funnily enough, but it was good enough that you can hear what he's saying and stuff. But he's a really he's quite similar to you in that he's got his boxing memory recollection is really impressive, particularly when it comes to his fights. He can kind of name the dates and the venues straight off the top of his head. He's really, he had a really interesting career and did very well. Okay. Gaz wants to know, how would you react or feel if a male fighter transitioned to be a female fighter and went through all the process of like the legal side of it and the operations and things like this, and then began fighting against women against female fighters?
I think you'd have to have an issue with it, wouldn't you? Alejandra Jimenez, the WBC, I believe, super middleweight female champion, was accused of that recently. Okay. Some people said that was just ignorance, just because she looks a bit butch, and and the whole kind of stereotypes of the dyke and all that. They said that she's actually fathered a daughter. Sorry, fathered her. But how Freudian was that? They said she'd actually had a daughter, and it was proven that she was a woman. She was biologically a woman, and just because she looks muscular, but just because she might look a bit masculine, it doesn't mean that she used to be a man. But I know. So I think a former opponent was trying to accuse her of having transitioned, which obviously that former opponent has a vested interest and an angle in it and is biased because of it, because she lost to her. But suppose it really happened, I don't think you could be in favour of it.
No.
I'd have to say no.
Funny enough, we ended up discussing this a bit on the fight show last week. My only issue with it is just like I wouldn't want to see a male MMA fighter go and take down a female MMA fighter, get her in full mount and the ground and pound and start or kick her in the face. I don't want to watch that. It's not my type of thing. It's not something which I don't want to watch. So how can I then be comfortable watching a male who's transitioned to be a female do the same? Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't accept them as a female transgender person in any way.
Just don't box.
People can do whatever they want, but when it comes to fighting, I just think you can't do that. You know, male body types are different. They're stronger, more muscular. They're quicker. It's an unfair advantage, and you're talking something. You know, someone could really get hurt in that situation, and that's without even discussing things about, you know, testosterone levels and stuff like that. There was a female MMA fighter who had transitioned called Fallon Fox a couple of years back, and she didn't inform her opponents that she had transitioned from being male. So I think she had about 2 or 3 fights where she was destroying the division. She was on this big winning streak, and the first few fights she took, she hadn't told her opponents that she had, you know, previously been a male. And to me, that's a real issue. Like, you have to, if there's
it's a bit worse than not declaring your record, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, if there's female fighters who are happy to take that fight, then great. But you have to give them the opportunity to make that informed decision. You can't not tell them, because, you know, that's terrifying in terms of, you know, what could happen when you, especially in MMA, where you've got things like chokes and kicks and knees and elbows. It brings up all sorts of what's the word? Like moral
quandaries, yeah.
It's a difficult one, because I don't care what people do with their lives, you know, if they can be whatever they want to be.
No.
But it doesn't mean that, you know, I want to see it from a fighting point of view. Just like I wouldn't want to see, you know, a husband beat up their wife or a girlfriend or whatever.
No.
Okay.
Indeed.
So last 3 questions, and I will thank you again for your time, mate. I really appreciate you giving me so much of your time. Was Muhammad Ali good enough to fight in any era of boxing?
Hell yes. You know, interestingly, George Foreman once said, I could have been a fighter in any era, whereas Muhammad Ali couldn't. He said, because Ali needed to wait for boxing to get a little bit more civilized before his style would have worked. So obviously, you know, George Foreman saw himself competing equitably in Jack Johnson or Jack Dempsey's era, which no doubt Big George absolutely could have done. But I think Ali could have done too. I think he had a revolutionary style to a degree, but it was informed by the likes of you know, Sugar Ray Robinson, and even guys before him like Gene Tunney and Billy Conn and Woody Pep had more similar styles than you might imagine to Ali's kind of jab and move approach. But no, Ali, I do think Ali was the greatest heavyweight of all time based on his body of work, strength of his body of work. And I think he compares favourably head to head with any of them. So absolutely, yes.
Indeed. And final question: who are the most overrated and underrated fighters on the current scene? Overrated and underrated.
Okay. Overrated, underrated. Who's overrated right now? I think I was going to say Errol Spence might not be quite as good as some people think he is. To say overrated sounds disrespectful when it sounds like it's coming from a kind of trolling angle. But see, I would have said Errol Spence if he was flying high and things were normal. The fact that he had a life-threatening crash, and now we're in a global pandemic, it's so much harder to see anybody as being at their absolute zenith, isn't it? We don't know when boxing's coming back, and we don't know when Errol Spence is coming back. I might have thought I would have picked out Terence Crawford over Errol Spence, for instance, on that basis. But I don't think Crawford is underrated for the flip side of that question, because I think most people realise how good he is. Who is a truly underrated fighter right now? I mean, I don't want him to see this, but I think Dylan White's, I'm not saying he's overrated, and my mate Mark Tibbs trains him, so this could be, you know, I'm not sure if Dylan gets the fans like him and he gets a lot of props, but I don't think he beat Anthony Joshua in a rematch, and I don't think people say what's he got to do to get a world title. You know what? He was offered a world title shot for whatever reason. He didn't want to accept the economic terms with Anthony Joshua back in April. in Wembley in that date that was ended up being scrapped, and then Big Baby Miller got the shot, and in the end he tested positive, and then John Ruiz got the shot. The rest is history. So to say that Dylan's been overlooked like it's he's some kind of Sonny Liston type figure, the uncrowned champion, I don't think is entirely fair. So I'm not saying Dylan's overrated as a fighter, but I think the perception of his plight is a little overrated, and I think some people think that he would beat Anthony Joshua in a rematch, whereas I tend to think not. So that. Assuming you're not going to go with big bold headlines, Ben Doughty says Dylan White most overrated fighter in the country. That's what I've said organically. I've just said it.
Yeah, no, I said it's not
most underrated. What was it? Most underrated? You still want that most underrated fighter?
Yes.
Let's go through the divisions. What lie? You know what? I would have once said Naoya in Inoue a little while ago, but I think he's getting the props now. You know, top power. I mean, Vasyl Lomachenko gets plenty of props. Saul Canelo Alvarez gets plenty of props. When you think of the best fighters in the world, Usyk gets plenty of props. So they're all really out there now. I would have said not Naoya Inoue, but I think he's rectified that. Nobody springs to mind to me who's chronically underrated right now, who should be getting those props, unless it might come to me afterwards.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, and that's pretty much all the questions. There's a couple of questions which I didn't get to just because they were kind of either repeating something which we'd already talked about.
Yeah.
So I apologise to anyone who feels that if I did miss anyone, send them to me again, and we'll do it again. We'll do it again. I'm sure we'll have you back on. But Ben, thank you so much for joining me, mate. I really appreciate it. Tell people where they can find you on social media, YouTube, wherever you want them to go.
Absolutely, I will do. And I mean, it was nice to break the ice in this way. And if you'd like to continue with some kind of dialogue, I'll be well up for it. Yeah,
cool. Yeah, I'm up for that.
That's all, mate.
So, guys, you can follow us youtube.com/AcePodcastNation. You can find the audio versions or all the usual places. We put out at least 4 shows a week at the moment. Some weeks we're putting out 5 or 6 because I've got a lot of shows backlogged and stuff. Next week we've got the former lead singer of The Farm coming on, some footballers, ex-Cardiff City players, everything you need. Live football show every Monday, live comedy show every Friday, fight show every Wednesday, and new shows every single Sunday, new guests, and we will see you next time. Again, Ben, thank you ever so much for your time, mate.
Thanks, mate. See you soon.